Silent chaos. Imagine walking into a room full of people, but the moment you step in, conversations stop. No one makes eye contact. No one acknowledges you. You sense something is wrong, but no one tells you what. That creeping anxiety. That's silent chaos, a dark psychology trick that creates unease without a single word. Silent chaos is one of the most effective ways to manipulate human emotions because it preys on one of our deepest fears: uncertainty. The human brain is wired to seek patterns and explanations. When we don't get them, our stress response activates. And when silence is used strategically, it can create more anxiety than any direct confrontation ever could. One study from 2014, published in the journal Brain and Behavior, found that uncertainty triggers a stronger physiological stress response than knowing something bad is coming. Think about it. If someone tells you, "You're going to get a painful electric shock in 5 minutes," your brain braces itself. But if they say, "You might get shocked at some point, or maybe not," your anxiety skyrockets. Silence and ambiguity create the same effect in social situations. This trick is often used in interrogation rooms. Law enforcement officers will sometimes remain completely silent after asking a question. Instead of filling the silence with their own words, they let the suspect stew in discomfort, increasing the pressure to confess or slip up. This technique, called the silent treatment, forces people to second-guess themselves. But this isn't just used in high-stakes interrogations. Silent chaos is a weapon in everyday power struggles. Imagine a workplace scenario where a manager suddenly stops responding to an employee's emails or questions. No feedback, no criticism, just silence. The employee starts to wonder, "Did I do something wrong? Am I getting fired?" This tactic exploits fear of the unknown, making the target anxious, compliant, and eager for reassurance. It's also a common manipulation technique in relationships. If one partner suddenly withdraws communication, the other is left scrambling for answers. This is known as stonewalling. Dr. John Gottman, a psychologist who has studied relationships for decades, found that stonewalling is one of the biggest predictors of divorce. Why? Because it doesn't just create emotional distance. It breeds paranoia. When someone shuts down, the other person starts overanalyzing everything, filling in the blanks with their worst fears. But silent chaos doesn't always mean total silence. Sometimes, it's about calculated nonverbal communication. Imagine you're at a social event, and every time you speak, someone in the group subtly glances at another person and smirks. They don't say anything, but their body language screams, "We know something you don't." This kind of silent, coordinated exclusion is a psychological attack. A famous study by Kip Williams at Purdue University demonstrated this with a simple experiment. Participants were asked to play a game of catch with 2 other people. At first, everyone played fairly. But after a few minutes, the 2 other players started throwing the ball only to each other, ignoring the participant entirely. The result: even though nothing was said, participants reported feelings of deep distress, rejection, and even physical pain. Brain scans showed that social exclusion activates the same brain regions as actual physical pain. Silent chaos, when used correctly, can make someone feel isolated and powerless without a single word being spoken. Let's talk about the workplace again. Silent chaos is a favorite tool of corporate power players. Imagine 2 colleagues at the same level. One of them wants dominance. Instead of arguing or asserting authority directly, they use silence as a psychological weapon. They withhold critical information, leaving their coworkers scrambling at meetings. They stop making eye contact, subtly signaling that the other person is irrelevant. Eventually, the target starts doubting themselves, their competence, and their standing in the team. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Silent chaos doesn't just work in one-on-one interactions. It works on entire groups, Have you ever noticed how social influencers or politicians sometimes pause dramatically before answering a question? Those long, silent moments force the audience to hang on their every word, making their eventual statement feel weightier than it actually is. In a way, they're hijacking your brain's discomfort with silence to make themselves seem more powerful. In extreme cases, silent chaos can be used in cult-like environments. Leaders will deliberately create tension by withholding approval or suddenly going silent on certain followers. This forces members to work harder for validation, deepening their psychological dependence on the leader. So, what's the takeaway here? Silent chaos is terrifyingly effective because it exploits a fundamental human need: the need for certainty. We crave explanations. We need to know where we stand. But when someone deliberately takes that away, our minds spiral into anxiety, self-doubt, and desperation for resolution. And here's the scariest part: you've probably fallen victim to silent chaos without even realizing it. That moment when someone's passive, aggressive silence made you overthink everything. That was silent chaos. The unanswered text that made you question your entire relationship. Silent chaos. The boss who ignored you in the hallway, making you wonder if you still had job security. Silent chaos. But here's the real power move. Once you recognize it, you take back control. When you feel that creeping anxiety from someone else's silence stop. Instead of scrambling to fill the void, lean into it. Force yourself to be comfortable with the unknown. Because the moment you stop reacting to silent chaos, the person trying to manipulate you loses all their power. I'd love to invite you into our cozy corner of the internet. Drop a quick comment and let us know where are you watching this from, and what time is it for you. It's pretty cool how we're all connected, searching for that perfect night's sleep. If these psychology tricks light up something in you, go ahead and subscribe our channel Restwise. We're more than just another sleep channel. We're a group of sleep explorers who know that a great night's sleep can change everything. Now, get comfy and let these psychology tricks guide you into a peaceful sleep. The Trojan horse approach. Imagine being welcomed with open arms, only to realize too late that the invitation was a trap. That's the essence of the Trojan horse approach. A psychological manipulation tactic that hides a dark agenda behind a friendly, seemingly harmless disguise. You don't see it coming until it's too late. And by the time you do, the damage is already done. This strategy is named after the legendary wooden horse the Greeks used to infiltrate Troy. After a decade-long war, they appeared to surrender, leaving behind a massive wooden horse as a gift. The Trojans celebrated, brought the horse inside their city, and while they slept, the hidden Greek soldiers inside emerged, opened the gates, and destroyed Troy from within. That's how the Trojan horse approach works in psychological manipulation. It disguises danger as something beneficial, appealing, or even necessary. One of the most famous psychological studies related to this concept is the foot in the door technique, first studied by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in the 1960s. They found that if you can get someone to agree to a small request, they are far more likely to comply with a larger one later. This is the psychological mechanism behind Trojan horse manipulation. You gain trust, establish goodwill, and then, once the person is committed, you introduce your true agenda. This tactic is everywhere. Politics, marketing, personal relationships, even cult recruitment. Let's start with marketing. Ever wonder why companies offer free trials? It's not just generosity, it's a Trojan horse. Once you start using a service, you get comfortable, integrated into your life, and before you know it, you're paying for something you never intended to. It's the same reason why many software products require you to enter your credit card for a free month. They're banking on you forgetting to cancel or deciding it's too much effort to leave. But let's go darker. The Trojan horse approach is a favorite weapon of manipulators in personal relationships. Picture this. Someone showers you with kindness, compliments, and attention. They seem perfect. Too perfect. That's because they might be. This is the opening phase of love bombing, a tactic often used by narcissists and abusers. They pull you in with overwhelming affection, making you feel special and safe. But once you're emotionally invested, the shift happens. They start controlling you, making demands, subtly isolating you from friends and family. The kindness was just the bait. In politics, this strategy is used to push agendas that people would otherwise reject. A government may introduce a law under the guise of national security or public safety, only for it to later be revealed as a tool for mass surveillance or control. Edward Snowden exposed how the U.S. government used anti-terrorism measures as a Trojan horse to justify widespread data collection on citizens. People accepted it because it was framed as protection, but the hidden agenda was mass surveillance. Another extreme example. Cults. Cult leaders rarely start by telling followers, "Hey, come join us, abandon your family, and give me all your money." No. They start with love, community, and purpose. They tell you, "We're here to help you grow." The deeper you go, the more the real demands surface. Suddenly, you're cutting ties with loved ones and devoting your life to the cause. By the time you realize it, you're trapped. The Trojan horse has already done its job. And this trick isn't just used by large organizations or sinister figures. It happens in everyday interactions. Think about a coworker who always offers to help with your work. They seem generous at first, but gradually, they start using it against you. "I've been doing all this for you. You owe me." The initial act of kindness was just a setup to put you in their debt. So, what's the takeaway here? The Trojan horse approach works because it bypasses natural resistance. If someone came at you directly with a manipulative demand, you'd reject it. But when it's hidden inside something appealing, whether it's a gift, an opportunity, or a loving gesture, you lower your guard. The best way to defend yourself. Look beyond the surface, question motives. Ask, what's in it for them? If something seems too good to be true, there's a chance it's a Trojan horse waiting to be wheeled through your gates. And once it's inside, you may not see the attack coming until it's too late. Weaponizing hope. There's a psychological trick so powerful that it can keep people trapped for years, chasing something they may never actually get. It's called weaponized hope, a manipulation tactic where someone gives just enough progress, encouragement, or reward to keep you invested, but never enough for you to actually reach the goal. This is how casinos keep gamblers playing, how toxic relationships keep people holding on, and how companies keep employees loyal without real career growth. It's a psychological trap that makes people believe that if they just try a little harder, wait a little longer, or give a little more, their breakthrough will come. But in reality, they're just being strung along. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon for decades. One of the most well-known experiments was conducted by B.F. Skinner, who discovered that variable reinforcement, random, unpredictable rewards, is the most addictive pattern of reinforcement. In one of his studies, he trained pigeons to peck at a button for food. Some got food every time. Some got it only occasionally at random intervals. The pigeons that received unpredictable rewards became obsessed, pecking the button nonstop, sometimes for hours. The same principle applies to humans. If a gambler wins every time, the game becomes predictable. If they lose every time, they stop playing. But when wins come at random, the brain stays hooked, always thinking, maybe the next time will be different. This is exactly how manipulative people use weaponized hope in relationships. A toxic partner who treats you poorly most of the time will still give you just enough affection, compliments, or apologies to keep you believing they can change. You tell yourself, they weren't always like this. Maybe if I just try harder, I can get them back to the way they used to be. But those moments of kindness aren't a turning point. They're bait to keep you invested. It happens in the workplace too. Ever had a boss who dangled a promotion in front of you? You work extra hours, take on extra responsibilities, and every time you ask about your progress, you hear, "Just keep it up. You're so close." But the promotion never comes. The goalposts keep moving. The hope of success is just enough to keep you from quitting, even though you should. Political systems use this trick on entire populations. Governments make promises of reform, justice, and change, but never actually deliver in full. They give just enough progress to prevent mass outrage. If things were entirely bad, people would revolt. If things were perfect, there'd be no need for politicians to promise change. But by maintaining just enough dissatisfaction, while offering occasional improvements, leaders keep people hooked on the idea that a better future is just around the corner. Social media platforms mastered weaponized hope. Ever notice how sometimes your posts get almost no engagement, and then, out of nowhere, one of them blows up? That's not random, it's part of the design. By making virality unpredictable, platforms keep creators posting, always chasing that next big hit. If every post went viral, the thrill would disappear. If no posts ever performed well, users would quit. But when success is inconsistent, people stay addicted. One of the darkest uses of this trick is in multi-level marketing, MLM schemes. New recruits are constantly told, "You're so close to making it big! Just keep grinding, and you'll be one of the top earners." They see success stories from the few people at the top, which fuels their belief that they can be next. But the truth is, most people in MLMs never make real money. They're just kept in the system with the hope that one more sale, one more recruit, one more month will change their fate. And then there are the ultimate examples: prisoners of war, cults, and oppressive regimes. Throughout history, captors have used weaponized hope to keep people from rebelling. Give prisoners just enough food to keep them alive. Just enough privileges to make them compliant. Make them believe that good behavior will lead to better treatment, even if it never actually does. So how do you break free from weaponized hope? The key is recognizing when you're being played. The moment you realize that someone is controlling your hope, deliberately giving you just enough to keep you from walking away, you have the power to break the cycle. Ask yourself, am I actually making progress, or am I just being kept on the hook? If you've been hearing the same promises for months, years, or even decades with no real results, that's a sign you're caught in the trap. The hardest decision to make is also the most freeing. To stop chasing hope that isn't real and walk away before you waste any more time. Ghostlighting. What happens when the person you rely on for connection suddenly evaporates, leaving you questioning every word, every gesture, and even your own reality? Ghostlighting is a dark psychological tactic where the manipulator vanishes without explanation, creating an environment of perpetual confusion and deep insecurity. This disappearance isn't random. It's a calculated move to destabilize your sense of self and leave you desperately searching for answers that will never come. In many cases, ghostlighting unfolds subtly. At first, you might notice minor inconsistencies in behavior or a slight delay in responses. Over time, these gaps widen until communication becomes sporadic and then completely absent. The victim is left clinging to memories and trying to piece together what went wrong. Without the usual feedback, every moment of silence transforms into a source of anxiety. Research in social psychology shows that uncertainty activates the same stress responses as physical pain, causing the brain to become hyper, vigilant, and prone to self-doubt. When someone who once provided stability vanishes, the emotional fallout can be severe, leaving the target paralyzed by insecurity. This tactic is not confined to personal relationships. It has been observed in professional settings as well. Consider a scenario where a respected colleague or supervisor suddenly disappears from the daily workflow without warning. Their absence creates a vacuum filled with unanswered questions. Was it a promotion, a reassignment, or something more sinister? The remaining team members are left to speculate, their anxiety mounting as they to compensate for the missing guidance. The resulting confusion can lead to a loss of morale and productivity, with each person second guessing their own contributions and worth. Ghostlighting operates on the principle that humans inherently seek connection and validation. When these elements are abruptly removed, the natural reaction is to search for meaning in the void. The manipulator leverages this reaction, knowing that the desperate need for closure will make the victim more compliant and vulnerable in future interactions. This tactic is particularly effective in controlling behavior because it not only isolates the target, but also forces them to rely on their own judgment, which is now compromised by uncertainty. One disturbing aspect of ghostlighting is how it intertwines with the well-known tactic of gaslighting. While gaslighting involves deliberate attempts to make someone question their own sanity through denial and distortion of facts, ghostlighting takes a different approach by simply vanishing. The silence that follows is deafening. Without confrontation or explanation, the victim is left to wonder if they imagined the connection in the first place. In relationships, this often manifests as one partner abruptly cutting off all contact, leaving the other partner spiraling into a cycle of self-blame and frantic attempts to restore the lost connection. The constant state of alert and confusion undermines the victim's confidence, eroding their ability to trust not only others but also themselves. In digital spaces, ghostlighting has taken on new dimensions. Social media platforms and messaging apps have made it all too easy for someone to disappear without a trace. A friend who once interacted regularly might suddenly vanish from your feed, leaving you to wonder if something happened, or if you somehow did something wrong. This modern form of ghostlighting amplifies the emotional distress because it occurs in a public or semi-public forum, where the absence of an explanation can be scrutinized by mutual acquaintances, adding an extra layer of humiliation and self-doubt. There are also cases where ghostlighting is used as a power play in competitive environments. Picture a scenario in a high-pressure industry where mentorship is key to success. A mentor who initially offers guidance and support may suddenly pull away, leaving their protégé isolated and uncertain about their abilities. The targeted individual is forced to navigate the treacherous waters of self-assessment, often leading to overcompensation or a decline in performance. The abrupt disappearance is not a sign of neglect, it is a deliberate strategy to control and destabilize, ensuring that the power imbalance remains firmly in the hands of the manipulator. Psychological studies indicate that such tactics can have long-lasting effects on mental health. Victims of ghostlighting often report symptoms of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. The constant questioning of their own judgment, the overwhelming need for closure, and the fear of future abandonment can leave deep emotional scars. In some cases, these experiences can lead to a pervasive sense of isolation, where the victim becomes increasingly withdrawn, reluctant to form new relationships for fear of repeating the same painful pattern. The insidious nature of ghostlighting lies in its subtlety. Unlike overt abuse, it leaves no physical marks or easily identifiable signs. Instead, the scars are internal, manifesting as a chronic state of uncertainty and a diminished sense of self-worth. Over time, the victim might start to doubt not only their recollections, but also their ability to judge the intentions of others. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle of vulnerability that the manipulator can exploit repeatedly. Every time the victim reaches out for clarification or connection, they are met with silence. A silence that reinforces the notion that their feelings, needs, and perceptions are unimportant. Understanding ghostlighting is the first step in defending against it. Recognizing the pattern is crucial: sudden disappearances followed by an unsettling void, the lack of communication that leaves questions hanging, and the relentless self-doubt that emerges from being left in the dark. Once you become aware of these tactics, you can begin to build boundaries that protect your emotional well-being. It is important to trust your instincts. If the silence of someone you once trusted feels too calculated or harmful, it might be a sign to step back and reassess the relationship. The ultimate takeaway of ghostlighting is its reminder that absence can be as potent as presence. In the world of dark psychology, the deliberate act of disappearing is not about physical withdrawal alone. It is about controlling the narrative. When someone controls the flow of information, they control the emotions and perceptions of others. The real power lies in forcing you to question your reality, to doubt your worth, and to search endlessly for explanations that validate your feelings. Recognizing this manipulation is empowering. Once you understand that the silence is not about you, but about someone else's need for control, you can begin to reclaim your sense of certainty and self-assurance. Hypercharisma. Imagine this: someone walks into the room, and within seconds, they have everyone smiling, laughing, and hanging onto their every word. They're magnetic, almost too charming. But you can't help but trust them anyway. What if I told you this isn't an accident? It's a calculated tactic, a psychological weapon called hypercharisma. Hypercharisma isn't just about being likable. It's about being so overwhelmingly charming that people's critical thinking shuts off. When someone is excessively friendly, overly complimentary, or showers you with attention, your brain gets confused. We're wired to believe that people who treat us well must have good intentions. This is known as the halo effect, a cognitive bias where one positive trait influences how we perceive everything else about a person. Take the infamous conman Frank Abagnale, portrayed in the movie Catch Me If You Can. He impersonated a pilot, doctor, and lawyer, scamming millions. Not through brute force or clever disguises, but by radiating charisma. He made people want to believe him. He smiled, made jokes, acted like he belonged, and flattered everyone in his path. By the time anyone questioned his credentials, they felt too emotionally invested to doubt him. So why does this work? Research in social psychology gives us the answer. Studies on reciprocity norms show that when someone gives us something, even just compliments or attention, we feel compelled to give something back. If someone bombards you with warmth and admiration, you subconsciously feel like you owe them trust or loyalty. This is especially powerful when the charm feels exclusive. If they make you feel like you're the only one who gets their special attention, that connection becomes even harder to break. Hypercharisma also taps into cognitive overload. When someone talks fast, tells stories, jokes, and compliments you all at once, your brain can't process everything critically. Instead, it takes mental shortcuts. And the easiest shortcut is to assume they're genuine. Studies from Princeton University found that people form first impressions within 1/10 of a second. A person radiating charm hijacks that snap judgment, steering it in their favor before logic has a chance to kick in. But here's where it gets even darker. Once the hyper-charismatic person has you hooked, they subtly pull back. They reduce the compliments or attention just enough to trigger a psychological principle called intermittent reinforcement. It's the same tactic that makes gambling addictive. Your brain craves the next hit of validation. And now, you're chasing their approval without realizing it. They become more powerful by giving you less. Let's break this down with a real-world example: cult leaders. People like Jim Jones and Charles Manson didn't start by being cruel or controlling. They began with overwhelming warmth and love. They made their followers feel special, chosen, even adored. By the time the manipulation and abuse started, their followers were emotionally trapped, still clinging to that initial wave of hyper-charisma. But it's not just con artists and cult leaders who use this. Think about high-pressure salespeople. They hit you with compliments. You look like someone who knows quality when they see it. Then tell fast-paced stories about other satisfied customers, throwing in a limited-time offer to create urgency. Your brain is too overloaded with positivity and scarcity to slow down and think. By the end, you're pulling out your wallet before you even realize what happened. So what's the takeaway? Hyper-charisma is powerful, but it's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or evil. Politicians, salespeople, influencers, even friends or partners might use it to gain your trust fast. The key to protecting yourself isn't to avoid charismatic people. It's to recognize when the charm feels too good to be true. Ask yourself, are they giving me space to think? Or am I being swept along by a wave of compliments and excitement? If it's the latter, slow things down. Real, lasting trust never needs to be rushed. Because in the end, the most dangerous manipulation is the one that feels like love. The illusory truth effect. Ever wonder why people believe things that are completely false, even when the truth is right in front of them? Imagine this: you hear a random fact, something like, humans only use 10% of their brains. It sounds interesting, maybe even a bit inspiring. Then you hear it again on a podcast, and later a friend mentions it too. By the third or fourth time, you're nodding along thinking, yeah, that sounds about right. But here's the twist. It's a complete myth. So why does it feel true? Welcome to the Illusory Truth Effect. The Illusory Truth Effect is a cognitive bias where people start believing false information is true simply because they've heard it repeatedly. It doesn't matter whether the statement is logically absurd or easily debunked. If you hear it enough, it sticks. Psychologists first uncovered this phenomenon in a 1977 study by Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Tapino. They found that people were more likely to believe statements they had heard before, even if those statements were false. What's wild is that this happens regardless of whether you're smart, skeptical, or even aware of the trick. So, why does this happen? It all boils down to how our brains handle information. Repetition increases fluency, the ease with which we process something. When a statement feels easy to process, we mistake that feeling for truth. It's like our brain says, hey, this sounds familiar. Familiar means safe and true, right? But that's not how reality works. Think about urban legends. Take the classic example of the Bermuda Triangle. You've probably heard that countless ships and planes mysteriously vanish there. But did you know the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has repeatedly stated there's no unusual number of disappearances in that region? Yet the legend persists because it's been told and retold so many times that it feels true. The illusory truth effect isn't just a quirky brain glitch. It's a powerful tool. Politicians, advertisers, and even social media influencers use it to shape beliefs. Politicians, for example, repeat the same slogans and claims over and over. Build the wall. Make America great again. Hope and change. Whether you agree with the message or not, you remember it. It sticks. And the more you hear it, the more you buy into the underlying belief system, even if you never intended to. Advertisers use this trick too. Think about the phrase, Red Bull gives you wings. It's been said so often, it's iconic. Of course, nobody actually expects to grow wings, but the repetition wires your brain to associate Red Bull with energy and performance. Even if that's not scientifically accurate. Let's go deeper. The internet has supercharged this effect. Fake news thrives on it. A 2018 study from MIT found that false information spreads 6 times faster than the truth on social media platforms like Twitter. Why? Because outrageous, emotionally charged falsehoods get shared and repeated endlessly, embedding them into the collective consciousness. People don't even realize they're being manipulated. They just know the information feels familiar. And that's enough to convince them. Even more unsettling, this trick works on everyone, no matter how logical or well-informed you think you are. Studies show that, even when people know a statement is false, repeated exposure still makes it feel more true. That's right. Even if you've been told it's a lie, your brain still gets tricked by the repetition. Let's take a historical example. Nazi propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, famously said, "Repeat a lie often enough, and it becomes the truth." This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a deliberate strategy. Anti-Semitic lies were hammered into German society over and over until they were accepted as reality, paving the way for one of history's darkest atrocities. It's a chilling reminder of how powerful this effect can be when wielded with malicious intent. But it's not just politics and history. The illusory truth effect seeps into your daily life in subtle ways. Ever noticed how product reviews influence your buying decisions? If you see the same glowing comments repeated on multiple sites, you're more likely to believe the product is good, even if those reviews are fake or planted by the seller. Companies know this, and bots to flood the internet with positive feedback, counting on repetition to win you over. Here's an even more personal angle: relationships. If someone repeatedly tells you that you're not good enough, or that you're the problem in every argument, you might start believing it, even if it's not true. Abusers, whether emotional or psychological, rely on this tactic to wear down their victim's self-esteem. Over time, the repetition reshapes the victim's self-image, trapping them in a cycle of self-doubt. So what's the takeaway here? The illusory truth effect shows how disturbingly easy it is to manipulate beliefs. If you hear something often enough, even a complete fabrication, it starts to feel like reality. This is why misinformation is so hard to fight and why propaganda has shaped history. The more you hear a lie, the more it embeds itself into your mind. It doesn't matter if the truth is more logical or backed by evidence. Repetition wins. Next time you hear a fact that sounds a little too convenient or a slogan that just won't leave your head, ask yourself, do I believe this because it's true? Or because I've heard it so many times that it feels true? Because the scariest part of the illusory truth effect, you might never know the difference. Emotional inversion. Imagine this: what if the very emotions that keep you up at night, fear, regret, anxiety, could be twisted, reshaped, and transformed into the very thing that lulls you to sleep? It sounds insane, right? But that's the power of emotional inversion, flipping pain into pleasure, and vice versa. Let's break this down. Our brains are wired to categorize emotions into neat little boxes. Good feelings like happiness, contentment, and comfort go on one side, while bad feelings, fear, sadness, anger, get locked on the other. But what if those boxes are just an illusion? Psychological research says they are. The truth is, emotions are less about the feelings themselves and more about the way we interpret them. Take fear, for example. Your heart races, your breathing quickens, adrenaline floods your system. It's the exact same physiological response, whether you're about to bungee jump or you're running from a predator. The only difference is what your brain decides the situation means. Researchers like Lisa Feldman Barrett, a neuroscientist and psychologist, argue that emotions are constructed by our brain based on context and past experience. They're not hardwired responses. So how does this help you fall asleep? Let's say you're lying in bed, heart pounding from racing thoughts or unresolved stress. Emotional inversion works by leaning into that sensation, instead of fighting it, and reframing it as something else. Imagine that anxiety isn't a threat, but rather excitement. That pounding heart? It's not fear, it's anticipation for something amazing. By hijacking your brain's interpretation system, you trick yourself into relaxation. Consider how athletes use this naturally. Olympic athletes often describe their pre-competition nerves as feeling pumped, rather than anxious. They experience the same jittery sensations, but their minds label it as readiness, not fear. The same principle can apply to sleep. If your heart is racing, tell yourself it's not panic. It's your body gearing up to plunge into deep, restorative sleep. It's the same rush you'd feel standing on the edge of a diving board, about to take the plunge. But let's take this even darker. What about pain? Can pain itself be flipped into comfort? Studies in the field of pain management show something fascinating: pain perception isn't fixed. In a 2014 study published in the Journal of Pain, researchers found that when people believed a painful stimulus was beneficial, like an ice bath helping with muscle recovery, they tolerated it farther and even reported feeling less pain. Their brains rewired the sensation from "this hurts" to "this helps." For sleep, this opens a weirdly powerful door. Let's say you're tossing and turning, feeling that ache in your muscles or the stiffness in your neck. Emotional inversion lets you reframe that too. Instead of registering it as this discomfort keeping you awake, you can frame it as a sign that your body is working hard to heal itself, that the soreness is a reward for a day well spent, like the satisfying ache after a hard workout. And this goes deeper. People who practice cold exposure, like Wim Hof followers, often report a kind of euphoria after enduring extreme cold. Their brains start associating the pain with a mental high, almost like the runner's high. What's stopping you from doing the same with emotional discomfort? Restlessness, unease, that creeping loneliness when the world is asleep. These can be reframed as signals that your body and mind are preparing to reset and recharge. It's all about the mental narrative you construct. Even guilt and regret, emotions that haunt people in the dead of night, can be inverted. Psychologists have found that guilt can actually be a motivating force when viewed correctly. A 2015 study from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology showed that people who reframed guilt as a sign of caring, rather than failure, were more likely to make positive changes and feel better about themselves. So that regret gnawing at you, it's proof that you're someone who cares, someone who's growing. Instead of spiraling into self-blame, you can let that thought comfort you. You feel this way because you have empathy, and that's a strength. The key to emotional inversion is understanding that emotions themselves aren't inherently good or bad. They're just raw energy, data, that your mind interprets. Pain can be pleasure. Fear can be excitement. Regret can be motivation. The moment you take control of the narrative, you strip those emotions of their power to torment you and turn them into tools to help you. So the next time you're lying awake, heart racing, thoughts spinning, and sleep feels miles away, try flipping the script. What feels like chaos might actually be your body preparing to heal, reset, and restore you. The fear might be excitement. The pain might be progress. And the exhaustion, it's proof you fought through another day, and that sleep is just on the other side of the inversion. Your mind is more powerful than you think. It's not about silencing the darkness. It's about twisting it until it works for you. Reverse sympathy trick. Imagine this: someone you know, maybe even trust, starts telling you about their struggles, how they're overwhelmed, misunderstood, and feel like the world is against them. You feel a tug of empathy, and before you know it, you're going out of your way to help them, support them, and even excuse their behavior. But what if I told you that this whole scenario could be a carefully crafted manipulation designed to make you feel responsible for their happiness? This is the power of the reverse sympathy trick, a dark psychology tactic designed to make someone feel bad for you, not for comfort, but for control. Let's break this down. Human beings are wired for empathy. It's part of how we survive and form social bonds. When we see someone in distress, our natural response is to help alleviate their suffering. This is called empathic concern, a concept studied extensively by psychologists like Daniel Batson. In his research, Batson found that when people experience empathy, they're more likely to offer help, even at a personal cost. The reverse sympathy trick hijacks this instinct. It weaponizes empathy. Here's how it works: the manipulator presents themselves as a victim. They might exaggerate their misfortunes or frame events in a way that paints them as the constant sufferer. They carefully control the narrative to ensure that you see them as helpless and misunderstood. The goal: to make you feel guilty if you don't help or support them. This creates an emotional debt, a sense that you owe them something. A classic example of this can be seen in toxic relationships. One partner might frequently bring up past hardships, maybe how they were mistreated by others or how life has been unbearably cruel to them. They'll subtly imply that you're the only one who understands them, the only one who can make things better. Over time, this creates a psychological bind. You start to feel that if you leave or stop helping, you're abandoning someone who desperately needs you. It doesn't stop there. This tactic is often layered with another psychological principle: cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that happens when your actions contradict your beliefs. For example, if you see yourself as a kind, compassionate person, but you resist helping this suffering individual, you'll experience that uncomfortable dissonance. To reduce it, you're more likely to double down on helping them, even when it starts hurting you. But why do we fall for it? One reason is something called the just world hypothesis, the belief that people get what they deserve. When we see someone suffering, we want to believe they're a good person who doesn't deserve their pain. The manipulator taps into this, encouraging you to think, if they're suffering this much, they must be a good person who just needs a break. Let's take it a step further. Some manipulators use what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, a reward system that keeps you hooked. Imagine someone who oscillates between pitiful vulnerability and moments of warmth, affection, or gratitude. This keeps you hopeful, believing that if you just help a little more, things will get better. It's the same tactic that keeps gamblers pulling the lever on slot machines. Unpredictable rewards create the strongest form of attachment. One chilling example of this in action is seen in high-control groups or cults. Leaders often share exaggerated stories of persecution or hardship. They paint themselves as martyrs, fostering loyalty from followers who feel compelled to protect or defend them. The more followers invest in helping, the harder it becomes for them to walk away. Their identity gets tangled in the belief that they're the savior of the victim. So what's the payoff here? Understanding this trick doesn't just protect you from manipulation. It reveals a deeper truth about human nature. Empathy is one of our greatest strengths, but it can also be turned against us. The reverse sympathy trick works because it transforms empathy into a weapon, making you feel like the bad person for setting boundaries or saying no. But the truth is, real empathy isn't about sacrificing yourself to save someone else. It's about mutual understanding and support, not control. The next time someone's misfortune seems suspiciously convenient or consistently demands your emotional labor without reciprocation, take a step back. Ask yourself, are you helping because you want it, or because you feel trapped into it? The most powerful realization of all. Recognizing that sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is refuse to play the game. Cognitive overload. What if I told you that having too many choices doesn't make you powerful? It makes you easier to control. This is the core of cognitive overload. A psychological manipulation tactic that floods your mind with more information and decisions than you can handle. And the wildest part, once you're overwhelmed, you become more vulnerable, more suggestible, and more likely to surrender control to whoever offers an easy way out. Let's dive into how this works. The human brain isn't built to handle infinite decisions at once. Psychologists like George Miller found that our working memory holds about 7 pieces of information. Give or take a couple, before it gets overloaded. When we're pushed past that limit, our brain's decision-making process starts to break down. We enter a state of decision fatigue, where making choices becomes increasingly difficult and exhausting. Manipulators weaponize this by overwhelming you with information, choices, or tasks, so many that your brain can't keep up. This overload leads to mental paralysis or impulsive decisions, depending on how the trick is played. Let's break this down with a real-world example. Ever been on a website with endless subscription plans, feature comparisons, and pop-up offers? You start with one simple goal, maybe buying a product, but before you know it, you're buried under options. Each one sounds like a limited time deal or the best value. The result? You either panic and leave, or more often, you cave and pick whatever option is framed as the safest or most recommended. This isn't an accident. It's cognitive overload in action. A famous study by Sheena Iyengar, known as the jam experiment, revealed this effect perfectly. In a grocery store, researchers set up a table with 24 different jam flavors for customers to sample. On another day, they reduced it to just 6 flavors. The result? People were more likely to stop and try the jams when there were more options. But they were 10 times more likely to actually buy when the choices were fewer. Too many options paralyzed them. Now imagine this tactic applied to more than just jam. Salespeople, scammers, even political strategists, they all know that if they bury you in options, conflicting data, or too many decisions, you'll get stuck in analysis paralysis. And that's when they swoop in with a solution. Their solution: your overwhelmed brain is so desperate for relief that you're likely to agree without questioning. But cognitive overload doesn't stop with choices. It can flood you with raw information, too. In interrogation tactics, a version of this trick is called the cognitive load technique. Interrogators might bombard a suspect with rapid, complex questions, forcing them to keep track of every detail. The suspect becomes mentally exhausted trying to keep their story straight, and eventually, they slip up or confess just to escape the pressure. On a broader scale, misinformation campaigns use the same principle. They drown people in conflicting reports, half-truths, and exaggerated claims. The goal? Not to convince you of a specific belief, but to make the truth so hard to find that you give up looking altogether. When everything feels equally unreliable, the manipulator's version of reality becomes the easiest one to accept. The payoff here is powerful. Once you're mentally overloaded, you're more likely to trust the person who simplifies things for you, even if they're the one who created the confusion in the first place. So how do you protect yourself? The key is recognizing when you're overwhelmed and pausing. Slow things down. If someone's pushing you to make a quick decision while throwing a million options at you, that's your red flag. Step back, focus on what really matters to you, and strip the problem down to its essentials. The fewer choices you allow yourself to focus on, the clearer your thinking becomes. The truth is, cognitive overload isn't just about making you feel lost. It's about making you so desperate for clarity that you hand over control. And knowing that, that's how you take the control back. Forced dependency. What if someone could make you believe you couldn't survive without them, even though you were perfectly fine before they came along? This is the core of forced dependency. A manipulation tactic where someone deliberately creates a situation where you need them, whether you realize it or not. The result: they become your lifeline, controlling your decisions, emotions, and even your sense of self. It's one of the most powerful ways to gain influence over someone, because once you depend on someone for stability, breaking free feels impossible. Let's dig into how this works. Humans are social creatures, hardwired to seek security and support from others. Evolutionarily, depending on others meant survival. Manipulators twist this instinct, creating situations where you rely on them for that same sense of safety, even if they're the one who took it away in the first place. The process starts with building trust. The manipulator might present themselves as a protector, helper, or problem solver. They come in at the right moment, offering support when you need it most, whether they manufactured the problem or just capitalized on it. This creates emotional reciprocity, the feeling that you owe them your loyalty and gratitude. Imagine you're overwhelmed at work, and a new coworker steps in to save the day. They help you meet deadlines, cover for you, and even talk you up to your boss. You feel relieved, even grateful. But soon, they start subtly reminding you how much you owe them. They make you feel like you can't handle the workload without their help. Before long, you're second-guessing yourself, relying on them to make decisions you used to handle confidently. This is strategic enablement. The manipulator creates a false sense of inadequacy by positioning themselves as the only one who can fix things. They foster reliance. The more you rely on them, the weaker you feel without them. Psychologists have studied this dynamic in abusive relationships. One example is trauma bonding, a term describing the intense emotional attachment that forms when someone alternates between comfort and harm. The manipulator might cause emotional pain, like criticizing you or creating problems, only to rescue you from the very situation they created. This cycle strengthens the bond because, in moments of relief, you feel closer to them. It doesn't stop at emotions. Forced dependency can extend into practical, day-to-day life. In financial manipulation, for example, someone might convince their partner to quit their job, promising to take care of everything. Over time, the partner becomes completely dependent on the manipulator for money, making it harder to leave, even when the relationship becomes harmful. The manipulator might say, "You wouldn't survive on your own," reinforcing that sense of helplessness. The same tactic appears in workplaces. A boss might deliberately withhold information or training, ensuring that employees never feel fully capable. They create a dynamic where employees are too afraid to leave, believing they'd fail anywhere else. Let's take it a step further. Some manipulators use social isolation to strengthen forced dependency. They subtly undermine your other relationships, planting doubts about friends and family. You might hear things like, "They don't really understand you like I do," or "They just don't want what's best for you." Over time, your social circle shrinks. The manipulator becomes the only person you feel you can trust, the only source of emotional validation. A chilling example of this is seen in cults. Leaders often isolate followers from outside influences, convincing them that the outside world is dangerous or misguided. The result: followers rely solely on the leader for guidance, support, and even their sense of identity. So, what's the payoff for the manipulator? When someone controls your sense of security, they control you. Whether they want emotional loyalty, financial control, or unwavering obedience, the end goal is power, disguised as protection or love. But here's the real twisty: forced dependency often doesn't feel like manipulation when you're in it. It feels like care, support, even love. That's what makes it so hard to escape. So how do you recognize and break free from it? The first red flag is noticing disempowerment. If someone's help leaves you feeling weaker instead of stronger, that's a sign. Real support empowers you to grow. It doesn't make you doubt yourself. Next, watch for controlled resources. Whether it's money, information, or even emotional support, manipulators often control access to things you value and use that control to keep you dependent. Finally, rebuild your autonomy. This starts with small, independent decisions. Reconnect with people who support your confidence and strength, not your weakness. The more you trust your own judgment, the less power a manipulator holds over you. The truth is, forced dependency isn't about love, loyalty, or protection. It's about control. But the moment you recognize that, you're one step closer to taking that control back. Mask of self-sacrifice. What if the person who always seems to be sacrificing everything isn't driven by genuine selflessness at all, but by a calculated desire to control those around them? This is the essence of the mask of self-sacrifice. A dark psychology trick where individuals pretend to suffer for others to gain power and influence over their relationships. They wear a mask of martyrdom, presenting themselves as the ultimate victim who endures hardship for the benefit of everyone else. And in doing so, they secure admiration, loyalty, and even guilt from those they manipulate. The strategy begins with a calculated display of vulnerability. These manipulators deliberately expose personal hardships, often exaggerating their struggles or taking credit for every sacrifice they make. They make it seem as if they are constantly putting the needs of others before their own, crafting a narrative where their pain and sacrifice become the ultimate proof of their virtue. The more they reveal about their supposed burdens, the more they expect and receive the gratitude and respect of others. This isn't about selflessness. It's about establishing a position of moral superiority that leaves you feeling indebted to them. Psychologically, this tactic taps into our deep-seated need to validate our own sense of goodness by supporting those who seem to embody it. Research in social psychology shows that witnessing acts of sacrifice can trigger what is known as moral elevation, a warm, uplifting feeling that makes us want to emulate such behavior. Manipulators exploit this reaction, understanding that when you see someone sacrificing for others, you're compelled to help, to support, and to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and appreciated. By constantly positioning themselves as the one suffering for the greater good, they make it nearly impossible for you to imagine a life where you don't play a role in their narrative. Consider the dynamic in many toxic family relationships, where one parent might always emphasize the sacrifices they have made for the children's benefit. They may recall times when they skipped personal opportunities, neglected their own needs, and endured emotional turmoil. All for the sake of the family. The message is clear: you owe them your obedience and gratitude. In these scenarios, children grow up feeling an unspoken obligation to live up to the sacrifices made on their behalf, often at the cost of their own independence. The parent's mask of self-sacrifice becomes a tool of control, subtly enforcing a bond of dependency that is hard to break. This tactic isn't confined to the family sphere. In the workplace, a leader might constantly highlight their own struggles, stressing how they have sacrificed personal time and resources to lift the team's performance. They might paint a picture of relentless dedication, all while expecting their employees to follow suit without question. When team members see their leader as the heroic martyr who bears all burdens, they are more inclined to overlook their own grievances and work harder, fearing that any complaint might tarnish the noble image of the person who suffers for us all. In this way, the leader consolidates power by aligning the team's identity with their personal narrative of sacrifice. The underlying psychological mechanism is one of guilt induction. When someone presents themselves as continually suffering, it triggers a sense of indebtedness in those around them. You begin to feel that any action you take against their wishes, or any attempt to prioritize your own well-being, is a betrayal of the sacrifices they've made. This is compounded by the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. When your self-image as a caring, supportive person clashes with the idea of letting someone down, You are compelled to act in ways that restore that balance. The manipulator exploits this by making it seem as if any deviation from their wishes is not only ungrateful but morally wrong. There is also an element of what some researchers refer to as the martyr complex. This isn't merely a personality trait, but a strategic performance that cultivates an aura of selflessness. Studies suggest that individuals who adopt this role often receive increased social support and deference because they are seen as noble and self-sacrificing. However, this support comes at a price that reinforces the manipulator's control over your emotions and actions. The more you applaud their sacrifice, the more you are drawn into their narrative, and the harder it becomes to question their intentions. Real-life examples of this tactic can be found in various contexts. Consider a friend who constantly reminds you of the time they helped you out of a tight spot, or the sacrifices they made during a difficult period in your life. Every conversation with them is laced with subtle hints that you owe them something in return. They may even accuse you of being ungrateful or selfish if you don't meet their expectations. Over time, this not only erodes your self-esteem but also establishes a pattern where your actions are dictated by their need to be seen as the perennial victim. Another striking illustration is found in certain political or social movements where leaders portray themselves as the ultimate sufferers, enduring personal losses for the sake of a greater cause. By doing so, they attract fervent followers who feel compelled to support them out of loyalty and a misplaced sense of gratitude. In these cases, the narrative of sacrifice serves as a powerful recruitment tool, drawing in individuals who might otherwise question the leader's motives. The payoff for the manipulator is clear once you are entrenched in their narrative of sacrifice. Your ability to make independent decisions diminishes. You become emotionally tied to their story, constantly seeking validation through your support for them. They are no longer just a person in your life. They become the center of your moral universe, and challenging their authority feels like a betrayal of your own values. The most alarming aspect of the mask of self-sacrifice is how seamlessly it disguises power dynamics. It cloaks domination in a veneer of compassion, making you believe that by supporting them, you are part of something noble and selfless. The realization that their suffering was a performance, a strategic maneuver to secure control, can be jarring. It forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that what appeared to be genuine altruism was, in fact, a calculated bid for power. Understanding this tactic is the first step in reclaiming your autonomy. Recognize that true self-sacrifice involves empowering others, not binding them to you through guilt and obligation. When you encounter someone who consistently uses their struggles to manipulate your actions, take a step back and evaluate whether you are being drawn into a relationship where your independence is compromised. The ability to critically assess the motives behind acts of sacrifice is essential in breaking free from this form of control. The mask of self-sacrifice is a potent reminder that not all that glitters is gold. Beneath the facade of martyrdom may lie a sophisticated playbook for emotional manipulation, designed to keep you tethered in a web of guilt and dependency. Once you see through the mask, you can begin to assert your own power and demand relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than manipulation disguised as selflessness. Blame shifting. What if every time something went wrong, you ended up apologizing, even when you had nothing to do with the problem? That's the power of blame shifting, a dark psychological tactic where someone cleverly dodges responsibility for their own actions by making you feel guilty for their mistakes. They twist every setback into a situation where you are the one at fault, leaving you questioning your judgment and slowly eroding your self-confidence. At its core, blame shifting is all about control. The manipulator uses subtle verbal cues and misdirection to deflect responsibility. When something goes wrong, instead of acknowledging their error, they quickly point the finger at you. This creates an environment where you begin to internalize the blame, feeling as if every mishap is somehow your fault. The tactic exploits our natural tendency to seek harmony and avoid conflict. In a bid to restore balance, you might start doubting your own perceptions, thinking, maybe I did do something wrong. This technique is rooted in powerful psychological principles. For instance, Research on self-serving bias shows that people naturally protect their self-esteem by attributing successes to themselves and failures to external factors. A skilled blame shifter flips this bias on its head, forcing you to accept the external blame even when it doesn't belong to you. Over time, the constant redirection of fault leads to cognitive dissonance, a state where your self-image as a competent person clashes with the negative feedback you keep receiving. To resolve this discomfort, you might subconsciously alter your memory or perceptions, eventually believing the distorted version of events that casts you as the guilty party. Consider a scenario at work: a team project falls behind schedule, and rather than admitting poor planning, the project leader insists that you failed to follow instructions, subtly undermining your competence. Each time you defend yourself, they introduce new details that make it seem like you're responsible for the project's shortcomings. With every exchange, you begin to doubt your abilities, accepting blame that isn't rightfully yours. The result isn't just a failed project. It's a gradual erosion of your professional confidence and autonomy. In personal relationships, blame shifting can be even more insidious. Imagine a partner who consistently avoids accountability by deflecting every issue back onto you. When disagreements arise, they accuse you of not supporting them or not understanding their needs, regardless of the context. This repetitive pattern forces you into a cycle of guilt and self-blame. Soon, you start believing that any friction in the relationship is due to your shortcomings, and you might even go to great lengths to placate them, further entrenching their control over your emotions. The manipulator's success in shifting blame is enhanced by the subtle art of selective memory. They often recall only the moments that support their narrative, omitting the times when you were, in fact, supportive or even when they themselves were at fault. This curated version of reality reinforces the idea that you're always the one who errs, and it's a narrative that can stick with you long after the incident has passed. Blame shifting is also common in families where power dynamics are at play. A parent might consistently blame a child for family tensions, insisting that the child's behavior is the root of every problem, even when the parent's actions are the real issue. Over time, this repeated pattern can instill a deep-seated sense of inadequacy in the child, affecting their self-worth well into adulthood. The child grows up carrying the heavy burden of guilt, constantly second-guessing their actions and feeling responsible for the emotional well-being of others. In the public arena, leaders sometimes use blame shifting to dodge criticism and maintain control. By constantly deflecting responsibility onto their opponents, or even the general public, they create an atmosphere where accountability is blurred. The narrative becomes one in which any dissent or criticism is seen as a personal failure on the part of the people, rather than a flaw in leadership. The effect is a populace that is too busy feeling guilty and self-reproachful to effectively challenge the status quo. So, what's the ultimate payoff for the blame shifter? Simple. They neutralize any challenge to their authority. When you are perpetually busy shouldering the blame, you're too preoccupied with self-doubt and guilt to confront the manipulator's actions. Your energy gets drained, leaving little room for critical thinking or self-advocacy. In this state, you become more compliant, more easily controlled, and more likely to accept the distorted reality they present. The key to breaking free from this toxic cycle is to recognize the red flags early on. Notice when criticism feels one-sided, when apologies are demanded without clear reason, or when you find yourself constantly apologizing, even though you know deep down you haven't done anything wrong. Empower yourself by questioning the narrative being forced upon you. Ask, is this really my fault, or am I being manipulated into accepting responsibility for someone else's mistakes? By challenging the blame shifter's version of events, you begin to reclaim your narrative. Ultimately, the realization that you are not the perpetual source of all problems is a liberating one. When you see through the manipulative tactics of blame shifting, you can start to rebuild your confidence and assert your boundaries. True accountability is about honest communication and mutual respect, not about one person offloading their mistakes onto another. Reclaiming your power means refusing to accept unwarranted guilt and insisting on a fair assessment of responsibility. By recognizing and understanding the mechanics of blame shifting, you take the first step toward dismantling its hold over you. You begin to see that the power to shape your self-worth and identity lies not in the manipulator's distorted narrative, but in your own capacity to stand firm and demand truth. In this light, blame shifting isn't just a tactic. It's a reminder of the importance of holding on to your integrity and of never letting someone else dictate your sense of responsibility or worth. Plausible deniability. Imagine this. You get caught in a lie, but instead of facing the consequences, you simply shrug it off with a perfectly believable excuse you set up before you even told the lie. It sounds almost too clever to be true, right? Well, that's the power of plausible deniability, a psychological trick that lets people escape blame by crafting excuses and doubt in advance, making it nearly impossible to pin them down. Plausible deniability works because the human brain craves certainty. When something goes wrong, people naturally look for someone to hold responsible. But when an excuse or alternative explanation already exists, it creates cognitive friction, a mental tug-of-war between believing you're guilty and believing the excuse. This internal conflict makes it easier for people to lean towards the more comfortable, less accusatory option, especially if they like you or want to avoid conflict themselves. Take this example: you're in school and you didn't finish your homework. You could just say you forgot, but that's suspicious and lazy. Instead, you mention to the teacher beforehand that your Wi-Fi has been acting up lately. Now, when you show up without the assignment, you've preloaded an excuse. The teacher already has a mental image of you struggling with bad Wi-Fi. You've planted the seed. When you say, yeah, the Wi-Fi cut out last night, it clicks right into place. They're more likely to believe you, even if you're lying through your teeth. This technique isn't just for small lies. Politicians, CEOs, and even intelligence agencies use plausible deniability on a massive scale. Ever notice how leaders often use vague phrases like, "I wasn't aware of that," or "that decision wasn't brought to my attention"? They're not exactly denying responsibility. They're creating enough ambiguity to dodge it if things go south. In fact, a famous example comes from the Watergate scandal. President Nixon didn't directly order the break-in. Or at least, that's what he claimed. His administration structured things so that if the operation failed, Nixon could plausibly deny knowing anything about it. The setup was intentional, creating layers of intermediaries to blur the chain of command. Even when the truth surfaced, that deniability protected him for a long time. But let's break this down even further. Why does this work so well? Psychological research offers a fascinating answer. A study from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people are significantly more forgiving when an excuse is presented before a failure happens. Why? Because the excuse shifts their expectations. When people expect a failure, they're less likely to be angry or disappointed when it actually happens. You've softened the blow in advance. Another layer to this trick is how it leverages a bias called confirmation bias. The brain's tendency to search for information that supports what it already believes. If someone thinks you're generally a good person, and you've provided a reasonable excuse ahead of time, their brain will work overtime to fit the excuse into their belief that you're innocent. They'll even ignore contradictory evidence to protect that belief. Let's look at this in a more manipulative context. Imagine you're a manager, and you know a project might fail. To cover yourself, you casually mention to your boss a week before the deadline, "The team's been struggling with the new software. I hope that doesn't slow us down too much." Boom. Now, if the project fails, you've already framed the failure as a result of the software issue, not your leadership. You're not lying outright. You're just setting the stage for doubt and ambiguity. And here's where it gets even darker. Plausible deniability can be weaponized against other people. Let's say you want a coworker to take the fall for a mistake. You can hint to the team beforehand, "I noticed Alex has been overwhelmed lately. Hope he's staying on top of things." Now, if something goes wrong, everyone already has a mental bias toward blaming Alex, even if he wasn't responsible. You've engineered a scapegoat without ever directly accusing anyone. The real takeaway here: Plausible deniability isn't about outright lying. It's about loading reality with enough doubt, enough alternative explanations, that when the truth comes out, if it comes out, people question reality itself. You're not just dodging blame, you're reshaping the narrative before it even begins. And the scariest part, once you realize how effective it is, you'll start noticing it everywhere. From the boardroom to the dinner table to the headlines on the news. Because the truth is, the most powerful lies aren't the ones we tell outright. They're the ones we prepare people to believe, long before we ever need to use them. Reverse foot in the door technique. People love to think they're in control of their decisions. But what if that very confidence could be used against them? That's the essence of the reverse foot in the door technique. A dark psychology tactic where you deliberately get someone to reject a small request first, making them more likely to agree to a bigger one later. Normally, you might have heard of the classic foot in the door technique, where you start with a small, reasonable request to build momentum before asking for something larger. But this flips that strategy on its head. Instead of easing someone in, you provoke them into saying no right away. Why? Because saying no makes people feel powerful, like they're standing their ground. And ironically, that feeling of control is exactly what makes them vulnerable to the next, larger request. Let's break this down with an example. Imagine a salesperson approaches you and asks, "Would you like to buy our premium $500 vacuum cleaner?" You scoff and say no. Of course you do, that's a ridiculous ask. But then they immediately follow up with, "All right, totally understandable. How about this more affordable $150 model instead?" Now, this second request feels not only more reasonable, it feels like a compromise. You feel like you've already asserted yourself by rejecting the first offer, so agreeing to the second one feels balanced, even fair. You're more likely to say yes because the salesperson gave you the illusion of winning the first round. The psychology behind this is fascinating. One key driver is the contrast principle. When two things are presented in sequence, the difference between them feels exaggerated. The second request feels smaller, easier, and more acceptable compared to the absurd first one, even if the second one is still more than you'd normally agree to. But there's more to it than that. Studies in social psychology, like those from Cialdini's work on influence, show that people also crave consistency. After rejecting the first offer, we subconsciously feel a need to balance out our behavior. The second, more reasonable request gives us a chance to feel like we're being fair, that we're not being too harsh or unreasonable. This technique isn't just for sales. It's everywhere, from politics to personal relationships. Let's say you're negotiating with a friend about where to go for dinner. You throw out a wild suggestion, "Let's drive 3 hours to that fancy seafood place." Predictably, they reject it. Then you counter with, "All right, how about that nice bistro just 10 minutes away instead?" Suddenly, the bistro, which might have seemed like a stretch originally, feels like the obvious, reasonable choice. They're now more likely to agree because they feel like they dodged a worse alternative. In politics, this shows up when leaders propose extreme policies or budgets they know will get rejected. The real goal is the second, compromise offer. The one they wanted all along, which now looks moderate by comparison. People breathe a sigh of relief and accept it, thinking they've avoided something worse. The beauty of the reverse foot in the door is that it creates an emotional journey. Rejection gives people a sense of autonomy, but that same rejection sets them up to lower their guard. By the time the second request comes, they feel more open, more cooperative, and more likely to agree to something they would have refused outright if asked initially. So what's the takeaway? When someone hits you with a ridiculous, over-the-top request, pay attention to what comes next. The second ask might not be as innocent or reasonable as it feels. And if you're the one making the requests, well, now you know how to nudge people into saying yes, by getting them to say no first. Semantic manipulation. Words are powerful. But what happens when they're deliberately twisted to control how you think? That's the heart of semantic manipulation. A dark psychology tactic where language is carefully crafted to reshape perception, influence emotions, and guide decisions without people even realizing it's happening. Here's the core idea: the way something is phrased can completely change how we perceive it. This isn't about lying outright. It's about reframing the truth so that it sounds more appealing, less threatening, or even totally different than it actually is. And because our brains process language so quickly and automatically, we often don't stop to question the way things are worded. Let's start with a simple example. Imagine you're hearing about a new product. One ad says, it's 90% effective, while another says it fails 1 out of 10 times. Both statements are technically true, but they feel wildly different, don't they? The first one sounds impressive and reliable, while the second one plants doubt. This is called framing, presenting the same information in a way that steers emotions and decisions. Research supports this too. A classic study by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman found that when people were presented with 2 versions of a problem, one framed positively and one negatively, they consistently made different choices, even though the outcomes were identical. Language shapes perception, and perception drives behavior. But semantic manipulation goes deeper than simple framing. One powerful technique is euphemistic labeling, using softer, more pleasant language to mask harsh realities. Governments and corporations are experts at this. A company doesn't fire employees, it right-sizes, or goes through workforce optimization. Politicians don't say civilian casualties. They call it collateral damage. These phrases sound sterile, less emotional, and they blunt the true impact of what's happening. It's not just wordplay, it's psychological anesthesia. On the flip side, the opposite tactic, dysphomistic labeling, makes something sound worse than it really is to provoke fear or outrage. For example, calling a tax a government theft, or describing a protest as a mob of rioters, instantly changes how people feel about the same event. The language primes emotions first, making logic an afterthought. Then there's redefinition, where a word's meaning is subtly shifted to manipulate beliefs. This happens a lot in politics and marketing. Think about how the word freedom gets opted to mean different things. For one group, it might mean personal liberty and fewer laws. For another, it might mean freedom from inequality and systemic oppression. Both sides claim to fight for freedom, but they're operating on entirely different definitions. When words become elastic like this, arguments stop being about facts and start being about which definition feels more correct. Even more insidious is presupposition, where a statement sneaks in assumptions that go unquestioned. If a headline says, "Why is this celebrity lying to fans?" the assumption that they're lying is baked right into the question. You're not even asked if they lied. The wording skips past that and moves you straight to wondering why they did it. This technique forces people to engage with the hidden premise without realizing they've already accepted it. One famous example: the war on terror. The phrase itself presupposes that there's a war, and that anyone against it must somehow be pro-terrorism. The framing locks people into a binary choice. You're either with us or against us, and eliminates any room for nuance or alternative views. Semantic manipulation doesn't just shape public perception. It works on a personal level, too. Let's say someone cheats in a relationship. Instead of admitting, "I betrayed you," they might soften it with, "I made a mistake," or "I was confused." Those phrases downplay responsibility, implying the act wasn't intentional or malicious. The language reframes the betrayal as an accident, making it harder for the other person to stay angry. The craziest part: once a manipulated narrative takes hold, it's incredibly hard to shake. Psychologists call this the anchoring effect. The first piece of information we hear becomes the mental reference for everything that follows. If a company launches a product and the first reviews call it a game changer, people are more likely to overlook flaws. But if the first headline says it's overhyped, even positive reviews feel suspicious. Words create the lens through which everything else is viewed. So what's the takeaway? Whenever you hear a statement that feels too good or too bad to be true, stop and ask yourself how it's being framed. Is the language steering your emotions? Are words being softened, exaggerated, or redefined to make you feel a certain way? Recognizing semantic manipulation is like breaking a spell. Once you see how the words are twisted, they lose their power to control you. Positive reinforcement poison. What if you could make someone addicted to their own bad behavior, without them even realizing it? That's the sinister heart of positive reinforcement poison. A dark psychology tactic that rewards harmful actions, training people to keep doing what's bad for them, while thinking they're winning. Let's break it down. Positive reinforcement, by definition, is when you reward a behavior to encourage it. It's the backbone of training, from teaching dogs tricks to getting kids to clean their rooms. But what happens when this technique is twisted, rewarding toxic, harmful, or even self-destructive behavior instead? The scary truth: people can become addicted to behavior that hurts them, if the rewards hit just right. Take social media, for example. Platforms are built on this exact principle. Post a picture, get likes. Make a snarky comment, get applause. Even if the behavior itself is negative, like seeking constant validation, oversharing personal struggles, or attacking others, the reward still feels good. Each like, comment, or share becomes a dopamine hit. The brain's feel-good chemical, and the cycle repeats. The science backs this up. Researchers like B.F. Skinner studied how variable rewards that come unpredictably, create the strongest form of reinforcement. It's why slot machines are so addictive. You never know when the next win is coming, but you keep pulling the lever anyway. Social media works the same way. Not every post blows up, but when one does, that unpredictable high keeps users coming back, even if their mental health is crumbling. This isn't limited to social media. It happens in personal relationships too. Picture someone in a toxic relationship. Their partner puts them down, belittles them, but then occasionally showers them with affection, apologies, or gifts. That sudden burst of positive reinforcement creates emotional whiplash. The victim clings to those rare good moments, hoping the next reward is just around the corner. Over time, they become hooked, mistaking the brief highs for love or progress, even though the overall relationship is draining them. It's like a twisted version of Pavlov's experiment. Pavlov trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by pairing it with food. In toxic relationships, the brain starts to associate the occasional good moments with the overall experience, even though most of it is painful. The emotional reward becomes tied to the entire relationship, making it feel impossible to leave. In the workplace, it's no different. Imagine an employee who works themselves to the bone. Their boss barely acknowledges their effort, until one day, they get praised for staying late or skipping lunch. That rare moment of validation keeps them chasing the next compliment, even though they're burning out. The reward isn't consistent, but that's the point. It's random enough to make the behavior stick. Marketers use this, too. Ever notice how online games reward you early on with easy wins, free loot, and level ups? That's positive reinforcement hooking you. But once you're invested, the rewards slow down. Now, if you want the next dopamine hit, you have to grind harder or pay up. The game poisoned its own rewards to turn you into a paying addict. Casinos are another classic example. They don't just rely on the jackpot. They pepper in small winks, free drinks, and flashy lights. Every little win fuels the belief that a bigger reward is just around the corner. The longer you play, the more you lose. But the occasional reinforcement keeps you hooked. Even worse, people start to rationalize their bad behavior to justify the rewards. A social media addict might say, "I'm just building my brand." A toxic relationship victim might insist, "They really love me deep down." The poisoned reinforcement becomes their proof that they can't stop, proof that the pain is worth it. And here's where it gets even darker: the person pulling the strings. Whether it's a partner, a boss, a corporation, or even an algorithm, knows exactly what they're doing. They control when and how the rewards drop. It's psychological puppetry, giving just enough to keep you craving more, but never enough to make you truly satisfied. So what's the takeaway? Whenever you feel trapped in a behavior that's draining you, stop and ask, what reward am I chasing? Is it consistent, or does it come just often enough to keep me hooked? If the reward feels unpredictable, like a slot machine jackpot, you might not be in control of your behavior anymore. Positive reinforcement is powerful, but when it's poisoned, it can turn you into your own worst enemy. Smiling every step of the way. Echo chamber control. What if the truth wasn't what you believed, but simply what you heard the most? That's the dark power behind echo chamber control, a manipulation tactic that traps people in a cycle of repetitive, reinforcing information until they stop questioning it entirely. The core idea: people tend to believe what they hear repeatedly, especially when it comes from sources they trust or align with emotionally. It's not about convincing someone with logic. It's about surrounding them with the same messages, over and over, until those messages feel like undeniable reality. This taps into a psychological phenomenon called the Illusory Truth Effect. Research from Lynn Hasher and colleagues found that when people hear a false statement repeatedly, they're more likely to believe it, even if they knew it was false initially. Our brains mistake familiarity for truth. In other words, the more often you hear something, the more right it feels. For example, let's say a politician keeps repeating, "The economy is booming." Even if people's wallets say otherwise, the repetition sinks in. After hearing it enough times, from speeches, news outlets, social media, and even friends who've heard the same message, people start to accept it, not because they've seen proof, but because the phrase becomes familiar, comfortable, and eventually convincing. Echo chambers magnify this effect. An echo chamber is an environment, physical or digital, where people are exposed only to beliefs that align with their own. Opposing views are filtered out, dismissed as fake, or ridiculed. Social media platforms make this worse by using algorithms that prioritize content you're most likely to engage with, which usually means content that reinforces what you already believe. It's no accident. Manipulators, whether they're politicians, cult leaders, or marketers, know that controlling the echo chamber means controlling the narrative. They ensure the same message is repeated across different platforms and by different voices, creating the illusion of widespread agreement. If you hear the same message from multiple independent sources, it feels more credible, even if all those sources trace back to the same puppet master. Take the tobacco industry in the mid-20th century. When research started linking smoking to lung cancer, tobacco companies didn't need to prove cigarettes were safe. They just needed to create enough doubt. They funded studies, planted stories, and repeated phrases like, "The science isn't settled," over and over. The goal wasn't to win the argument, it was to make the truth feel murky. And it worked. For decades, millions continued to smoke, clinging to that seed of doubt. This manipulation isn't just for corporations and politicians. It happens in personal relationships too. A toxic partner might repeatedly tell you, "No one else would love you like I do." Hear it enough times, and even the strongest person starts to believe it. The repetition reshapes self-worth and traps the victim in the relationship. But here's where it gets even darker. The more invested someone becomes in an echo chamber, the harder it is to pull them out. The brain craves consistency. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when new information contradicts what we believe. To avoid that discomfort, people instinctively reject anything that challenges the narrative they've been immersed in. For example, someone who spent years believing a certain conspiracy theory won't just reject new evidence. They'll double down on their original belief. Why? Because admitting they were wrong means admitting they were manipulated. It's easier to dismiss the new evidence as fake than to face the uncomfortable truth. Echo chamber control weaponizes this. Manipulators frame outside information as dangerous or deceptive before their audience even hears it. If an opposing voice speaks up, the manipulator has already planted the idea that they're lying to you. This preemptive discrediting ensures the echo chamber stays intact, shielding followers from anything that might break the illusion. So what's the takeaway? Recognizing you're in an echo chamber isn't easy, but it's crucial. Ask yourself, are you hearing the same phrases repeated from multiple sources? Do those sources seem to dismiss or attack opposing views without addressing them logically? Does new information feel uncomfortable or even threatening to your beliefs? That discomfort might be a sign you're trapped in an echo chamber. The harsh truth. If someone controls what you hear over and over, they control what you believe. And if they control what you believe, they control you. The deliberate confusion tactic. When clarity serves as a threat to power, confusion becomes a strategic weapon. The deliberate confusion tactic operates on a simple premise: overwhelm someone with complexity until they surrender their autonomy in frustration. This psychological technique exploits our natural cognitive limitations and our discomfort with feeling intellectually inadequate. The banking industry offers a perfect case study. Financial contracts deliberately written in dense, technical language with clauses buried in pages of text. Research from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that the average credit card agreement requires a reading level equivalent to a PhD, effectively ensuring most consumers cannot fully comprehend what they're signing. When confronted with this deliberate complexity, people typically default to trust rather than comprehension, relinquishing critical decision-making power. This tactic appears throughout bureaucratic systems, government forms with contradictory instructions, insurance policies with overlapping exclusions, or corporate complaint procedures with Byzantine processes. A Harvard Business School study revealed that for every additional step in a complaint resolution process, approximately 25% of people abandon their pursuit of redress. The complexity isn't accidental. It's designed to discourage persistence. The deliberate confusion tactic works because humans have a fundamental aversion to cognitive strain. When faced with excessive complexity, we experience what psychologists call cognitive overload. Our mental processing capacity becomes overwhelmed, triggering anxiety and avoidance behaviors. MRI studies show that confronting deliberately complex information activates the same brain regions associated with physical discomfort. Technology interfaces often employ this manipulation. Complicated privacy settings buried under multiple menu layers, subscription cancellation processes that require navigating labyrinthine pathways, or user agreements designed to obscure rather than clarify. Research from the University of Michigan found that deliberately complicated user interfaces can reduce opt-out rates by up to 78%. People simply give up rather than navigate the complexity. Perhaps most insidious is how this tactic exploits our social reluctance to appear confused. Many people avoid asking for clarification out of fear of looking unintelligent. A Stanford study demonstrated that even when participants didn't understand information presented to them, 64% reported understanding rather than requesting explanation. This social pressure creates perfect conditions for exploitation through deliberate confusion. The technique appears in interpersonal manipulation as well. The partner who explains away concerning behavior with increasingly convoluted justifications. The colleague who buries simple requests in excessive technical jargon. The salesperson who overwhelms with statistics and specifications until mental fatigue leads to acquiescence rather than informed decision making. Gaslighting, making someone question their perception of reality, often employs deliberate confusion as a foundational element. By providing contradictory information, changing explanations, or introducing unnecessary complexity into simple situations, manipulators create cognitive dissonance that weakens their target's confidence in their own judgment. What makes this tactic particularly effective is how it creates self-blame. When unable to navigate deliberately complex systems, people typically fault their own intellectual capabilities rather than recognizing the intentional design. Research from Yale University shows that experiences of confusion in bureaucratic systems correlate with decreased self-efficacy and increased feelings of helplessness, exactly the psychological states that facilitate control and compliance. The antidote begins with recognition. When encountering systems, explanations, or processes that seem unnecessarily complicated, consider whether the complexity serves any legitimate purpose. Ask specific questions that isolate individual elements rather than trying to process everything at once. Legitimate complexity can be explained clearly. Deliberate confusion typically can't withstand persistent requests for clarification. Remember that confusion is sometimes the point, not the byproduct. When someone makes something needlessly complicated, they're not failing to communicate. They're succeeding at obfuscation. By recognizing this dark psychological tactic, you reclaim the power to demand clarity or walk away when it isn't provided. In a world where information often serves as currency, understanding when confusion is being weaponized against you provides essential psychological protection. The Pied Piper Effect. Throughout history, charismatic figures have mastered the art of drawing others into their orbit through a compelling promise purpose. Like the legendary piper who led children away with enchanting melodies, modern manipulators understand that humans hunger for meaning more desperately than almost anything else. This psychological vulnerability creates the perfect conditions for a particularly insidious form of control. The Pied Piper effect operates on our deep-seated need to believe our lives matter. Neuroscience research from the University of Pennsylvania demonstrates that the brain's reward centers activate more strongly when people believe they're contributing to something meaningful than when they receive material rewards. This biological response creates the perfect foundation for manipulation. Offer someone purpose, and you access motivational drivers more powerful than money or comfort. Consider how cults establish control. They rarely begin with restrictions or demands. Instead, They offer what appears to be profound purpose: saving the world, achieving spiritual enlightenment, or building an ideal community. A comprehensive study from the International Cultic Studies Association found that 89% of cult members initially joined because they believed they were participating in something uniquely meaningful. The restrictions and exploitation came later, introduced gradually after purpose-driven commitment was established. Corporate environments frequently deploy this manipulation. Companies craft inspiring mission statements about changing the world, while creating working conditions that contradict these lofty ideals. Research from MIT's Sloan School of Management reveals that organizations emphasizing purpose-driven narratives can extract up to 29% more unpaid overtime from employees compared to companies with more transactional cultures. The promise of meaning becomes a substitute for fair compensation or treatment. Political movements demonstrate the Pied Piper effect on a larger scale. Charismatic leaders frame complex societal problems with simplistic narratives that position followers as heroic participants in historic missions. Studies from Princeton's Department of Political Psychology show that people who believe they're participating in historically significant movements demonstrate significantly higher tolerance for ethical compromises and contradictory information. The intoxication of purpose overrides critical thinking. What makes this manipulation particularly effective is how it exploits identity formation. When someone incorporates a purpose into their self-concept, "I'm the kind of person who fights for this cause," challenging that purpose becomes psychologically threatening. Research from Stanford demonstrates that questioning purpose-driven beliefs activates the same brain regions as physical threats, triggering defensive reactions rather than rational assessment. Digital manipulation has elevated the Pied Piper effect to unprecedented levels. Social media algorithms identify users' values and aspirations, then feed them content that frames participation in certain groups or movements as meaningful and important. A Harvard study found that engagement increases by 41% when users believe their online activity contributes to meaningful change, regardless of whether any real-world impact occurs. The perception of purpose becomes a powerful engagement tool. The false sense of purpose often comes packaged with strategic enemies. By positioning certain groups as obstacles to the noble mission, manipulators create powerful in-group out-group dynamics. Psychological research shows that perceived threats to purpose-driven goals trigger stronger emotional responses than threats to personal welfare. This explains why people often react more intensely to ideological challenges than to practical problems affecting their daily lives. What distinguishes genuine purpose from manipulation? Authentic purpose-driven organizations demonstrate several key characteristics: transparency about methods and outcomes, willingness to acknowledge failures and limitations, and respect for individual autonomy within the collective mission. Manipulative purpose, by contrast, demands unwavering commitment, frames questioning as betrayal, and gradually increases demands while decreasing rewards. The slow escalation of commitment represents a crucial element of the Pied Piper technique. Like the proverbial frog in gradually heating water, followers are led step by step toward increasingly extreme positions or sacrifices. Yale research on radicalization processes shows that people rarely embrace extreme positions immediately. Instead, they follow a progression of increasingly significant commitments, each one making the next seem less dramatic by comparison. Perhaps most insidiously, the Pied Piper effect creates a psychological dependency, where self-worth becomes contingent on serving the provided purpose. Research from Columbia University demonstrates that when people derive their primary sense of meaning from external sources, particularly charismatic leaders or exclusive groups, they experience significant psychological distress when separated from these sources. This dependency ensures continued compliance. Protection from this manipulation begins with cultivating diverse sources of meaning. Psychological resilience research shows that people with multiple pillars of purpose, relationships, personal growth, community involvement, creative expression, are less susceptible to manipulative purpose narratives. When meaning comes from many sources, no single entity can claim to be its exclusive provider. Recognizing the difference between being inspired and being exploited requires regular reflection. Does this purpose serve me as much as I serve it? Does questioning remain welcome? Does the promised meaning manifest in genuine well-being? The Pied Piper's melody sounds beautiful precisely because it resonates with our deepest needs. Learning to distinguish between those who nurture our authentic purpose And those who exploit our hunger for meaning represents one of life's most crucial psychological skills. Hypernormalization. What if reality itself felt so chaotic and extreme that you stopped questioning it and just accepted the absurd as normal? That's the twisted core of hypernormalization, a psychological manipulation tactic designed to overload people with so many outrageous, contradictory, or bizarre situations that they eventually stop resisting and adapt to the insanity. It sounds dystopian, but it's disturbingly real. The term hypernormalization was coined by sociologist Alexei Yurchik to describe the Soviet Union's final years. People knew the system was broken. The government knew it too. But the lies and propaganda were so overwhelming, and the truth so unreachable, that everyone played along, pretending everything was fine because they couldn't imagine an alternative. The bizarre became normal, and the fake became reality. Here's how it works. The first step. Overload. People are hit with so many conflicting narratives, extreme events, or exaggerated claims that they can't process what's true or false anymore. The mind, wired for patterns and logic, short circuits when faced with endless contradiction. When nothing makes sense, the brain defaults to the easiest path: acceptance. It's a psychological surrender. Take modern news cycles. One day, you hear about a global pandemic. The next, there's a celebrity scandal, then a geopolitical crisis, then a new technological breakthrough. And that's just Monday. The rapid-fire delivery of extremes isn't accidental. The more overwhelmed people feel, the less they question any one thing. They're too busy keeping up to stop and analyze. This isn't just a media tactic. It's used in politics too. A leader might make so many shocking, contradictory statements that the public stops reacting. The first outrageous statement causes uproar. The 10th. People shrug it off. The absurd becomes routine. What once seemed unacceptable now feels like just another day. A chilling example. Look at authoritarian regimes. North Korea bombards citizens with extreme claims, like their leaders inventing everything from the hamburger to controlling the weather. On the surface, it sounds laughable. But when it's repeated often enough, alongside real, terrifying punishments for dissent, the population stops questioning. The unreal becomes familiar. Familiar feels safe, and safe feels true. Hypernormalization also thrives in toxic relationships. Imagine a partner who constantly swings between grand romantic gestures and cruel manipulation. One day, they shower you with gifts and affection. The next, they accuse you of betrayal for no reason. The emotional whiplash is deliberate. It keeps you off balance, too exhausted to figure out what's real. Over time, the chaos feels normal. Even the cruelty starts to feel expected or deserved. The same tactic plays out in corporate culture. Ever worked for a company that constantly changes its policies, leadership, or priorities? At first, employees push back. But after enough reorganizations, layoffs, and mixed messages, people stop fighting. They numb out. They clock in, clock out, and stop believing anything will change. Because the abnormal has become the new normal. But hypernormalization doesn't stop there. It evolves. Once the manipulated accept the bizarre as normal, the narrative escalates. Each new extreme is more shocking than the last, yet it lands with less and less resistance. What once would have caused outrage now barely earns a raised eyebrow. People become desensitized, and manipulators exploit that numbness to push boundaries further. For example, in propaganda, heavy states, leaders may begin by denying small truths, then gradually rewrite history entirely. It's not a sudden shift but a slow, relentless distortion of reality. Each new version is more unbelievable, but by then, the people are so conditioned they go along with it. The tactic works because the alternative, acknowledging they've been deceived all along, feels even more unbearable. Even entertainment isn't immune. Reality TV thrives on this principle. Shows start off mildly ridiculous, then escalate, pushing contestants into more extreme, dehumanizing situations. At first, viewers are shocked. By the next season, the same behavior is expected. What started as absurd becomes entertainment. It's hypernormalization in action, conditioning audiences to accept and crave escalating insanity. Here's where it gets even darker. The final stage of hypernormalization isn't just acceptance. It's participation. Once people are broken down enough, they start reinforcing the false reality themselves. They repeat the propaganda. They defend the chaos. They convince others that this is just how things are. The manipulated become the enforcers, spreading the distortion further. They laugh at the things that once horrified them. They mock anyone who questions it. The abnormal is now not only normal, it's desirable. So how do you escape this mental trap? The key is recognizing the pattern. When everything starts feeling too extreme, too outrageous to be real, stop and ask, who benefits from me feeling overwhelmed? Are the events truly connected? Or am I being led to believe they are? Is the constant stream of insanity making me question reality, or making me stop questioning altogether? Hypernormalization feeds on your exhaustion. It wins when you stop caring. But awareness breaks the cycle. Once you see the pattern, the manipulation loses power. Because the greatest weapon against an unreal reality is remembering what's real. Yes, set technique. What if you could guide someone into agreeing with you, without them even realizing they're being led? That's the power of the yes set technique. A psychological manipulation strategy designed to build momentum by getting someone to say yes to a series of small, easy statements until they instinctively say yes to the bigger final request. It's not just a persuasion trick. It's a masterclass in exploiting human behavior, and it works far better than most people realize. The human brain is wired for consistency. Once someone starts agreeing with you, they're far more likely to keep agreeing, even when the stakes get higher. It's a psychological snowball effect. Each yes makes the next one easier, like a mental domino chain falling. Let's break it down with an example. Imagine a salesperson. They don't start by asking, "Do you want to buy this expensive product?" That would trigger resistance immediately. Instead, they warm you up with a series of harmless, agreeable questions. Isn't this product interesting? Wouldn't it be nice to save time on this task? Don't you deserve something that makes your life easier? Each yes seems small and insignificant, but it's building psychological momentum. By the time they drop the real question, would you like to take one home today? Your brain is already locked into agree mode. Saying no now feels uncomfortable and unnatural because it breaks the rhythm. This tactic doesn't stop at sales. Politicians use it too, and they're masters of the game. A politician might start with a speech full of statements no one can argue with. Don't you want a better future for your children? Shouldn't hardworking people get a fair chance? Isn't it time for change? Each statement pulls the crowd in. By the time they present their actual plan, whether it's a new policy, a donation request, or a controversial stance, people are already nodding along. It feels less like persuasion and more like a natural, inevitable conclusion. Let's dive into the psychology behind this. The yes set works because of commitment and consistency bias, a concept heavily studied by Dr. Robert Cialdini. Once we publicly commit to a position, we feel an unconscious need to stay consistent with it. Saying yes to one thing makes us more likely to say yes to the next, especially if the statements feel connected. There's also the foot in the door effect, where agreeing to small requests increases the likelihood of agreeing to bigger ones. But the yes set is sneakier. Instead of asking for small favors, it starts with harmless, undeniable truths, things that feel too obvious to resist. This lowers your guard faster and primes you for the bigger ask. Let's flip the script to relationships. Say someone wants to convince their partner to go on a vacation they're unsure about. Instead of starting with the hard ask, "Let's book that expensive trip to Hawaii," they build a yes set first. Wouldn't it be nice to take a break from work? Don't you miss spending more time together? Wouldn't it feel amazing to relax on a beach somewhere warm? By the time they suggest Hawaii, it feels like a natural next step, not an abrupt, expensive decision. The yeses soften the path, but this technique gets even darker. Cults and extremist groups rely on it to lure people in. They start with relatable, agreeable ideas. Don't you feel like the world is unfair? Wouldn't it be great to belong to a group that understands you? Shouldn't people like us stick together? Each yes builds a bond. And before recruits realize it, they're agreeing to more extreme beliefs or actions that would have sounded insane at the start. The momentum traps them. Even social media algorithms use this manipulation. Platforms start by showing you content you agree with, light, easy topics you already like. Then they escalate. Suddenly, you're seeing more polarized, radical content, but because you've been nodding along the whole time, it feels like a natural progression. You're locked in. So, how do you defend against the yes set? First, recognize the pattern. If someone fires a string of easy, obvious questions at you, ask yourself you, where is this leading? Pause and analyze before you get swept along. Second, break the flow. You don't owe anyone a yes just because you've already agreed a few times. A conscious, hold on, let me think about this, interrupts the momentum and resets your mental state. Finally, ask yourself who benefits. If the conversation starts feeling too smooth, too agreeable, it's worth questioning whose agenda is really being served. The yes set isn't inherently evil. Skilled negotiators, teachers, and therapists use it to guide people toward positive outcomes. But in the wrong hands, it's a weapon that turns agreement into manipulation. Because the truth is, the most dangerous yes is the one you never realized you gave. Selective amnesia. What if someone could rewrite reality? Not by changing the facts, but by strategically forgetting the parts that make them look bad. That's the dark power of selective amnesia, a manipulation tactic where people conveniently erase key details from their version of events to dodge accountability, twist narratives, and shift blame. It's not total memory loss. It's selective, calculated, and weaponized for personal gain. Let's start with a simple example. Imagine someone borrows money from you. A week later, they pay you back, but conveniently forget the part where you also covered their dinner and gas money that same night. When you bring it up, they act surprised, maybe even defensive. I thought I paid you back everything. Are you sure you're not mistaken? By leaving out just a slice of the truth, they make you feel like the unreasonable one. It's gaslighting wrapped in fake innocence. This tactic thrives in arguments and relationships. Ever notice how some people only seem to remember the times they were wronged, but forget their own mistakes? Picture a couple fighting. One partner remembers every time they were ignored or hurt but conveniently forgets the times they lashed out or shut the other person down. Suddenly, they're the eternal victim, and the other person feels like the villain. The psychological core of selective amnesia ties into confirmation bias, where people unconsciously favor information that supports their beliefs while ignoring what contradicts them. But this isn't unconscious. It's deliberate. Manipulators pick their memories to craft a reality where they're always right and others are always wrong. And it doesn't stop at personal relationships. This tactic scales all the way to politics and media. Politicians masterfully use selective amnesia to dodge scandals or reshape their public image. 1 year, they support a controversial policy. A few years later, when the public turns against it, they act like they never backed it. If pressed, they might downplay it. Well, that wasn't exactly what I meant at the time. They're not lying outright. They're strategically erasing inconvenient details. Take historical revisionism. Some governments rewrite textbooks, leaving out uncomfortable truths, like human rights abuses, corruption, or failed wars, while highlighting only their successes. The goal? To control how future generations perceive the past. When you control the memory, you control the narrative. Corporate leaders pull this trick too. Imagine a CEO announcing a bold new strategy. When it fails, they suddenly forget they ever endorsed it, blaming middle management or the market instead. Employees who remember the truth are left wondering if they misremembered things, or if speaking up will cost them their jobs. Even in friendships, selective amnesia can be a slow, corrosive poison. Ever had a friend who constantly downplays the times they hurt you, but never forgets the times you let them down? Over time, they mold the dynamic so you're always apologizing, always making it up to them. They become the perpetual martyr, and you're stuck playing the role of the flawed one. So why does this tactic work so well? It's because people trust their own memories more than anything else. If someone confidently misremembers an event, it creates cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable clash between what you recall and what they insist is true. The brain hates this conflict, so we're wired to resolve it fast. And too often, that means doubting ourselves. Plus, selective amnesia plays on our natural empathy. When someone acts like they genuinely forgot something, especially if they seem hurt or confused, we're more likely to let it go. After all, everyone forgets things sometimes, right? But make no mistake, selective amnesia isn't forgetfulness, it's a weapon. And like any weapon, it can be turned back on the manipulator. So how do you defend yourself? 1. Keep receipts. When dealing with someone who forgets, at suspiciously convenient times, document things. Texts, emails, agreements. Facts don't get blurry when they're in writing. 2. Call out the pattern. not the incident. Instead of arguing about a specific forgotten detail, point out how they seem to forget only when it benefits them. This shifts the focus from defending one event to recognizing the behavior itself. 3. Trust your own memory. If someone's version of events contradicts yours in a way that conveniently benefits them, trust your instincts. Manipulators thrive on making you doubt yourself. The second you stop trusting your own mind, they win. Selective amnesia isn't just about forgetting. It's about reshaping reality, tilting the scales, and leaving you questioning what's true. And the scariest part, it's so subtle, most people don't realize it's happening until it's too late. Because in the wrong hands, a half-truth isn't halfway harmless. It's a whole lie in disguise. Teflon Persona. Ever wonder how some people manage to remain untouchable no matter what scandal or criticism they face? That's the mysterious power of the Teflon Persona, a psychological manipulation strategy that creates an image so bulletproof that negative information simply slides right off. It's not about being flawless or hiding mistakes. It's about constructing a persona so compelling and consistent that every misstep, every criticism, is absorbed and deflected before it can take hold. Imagine a public figure whose every public appearance radiates confidence, generosity, and an almost magnetic charm. Their image is meticulously crafted over time, a combination of carefully chosen words, strategic public actions, and a relentless effort to appear beyond reproach. When a scandal inevitably surfaces, supporters quickly dismiss it as a misinterpretation or a smear campaign. This is the Teflon persona in action. Flaws don't stick because the overall narrative is too strong to be undermined. The secret behind this tactic lies in two powerful psychological phenomena, the halo effect and cognitive dissonance. The halo effect, a well-documented phenomenon in social psychology, means that when we see one admirable trait in a person, say, charisma or brilliance, we tend to assume all their traits are positive, regardless of contrary evidence. If a celebrity is known for their philanthropic efforts and charm, minor controversies or even significant failings are often reinterpreted as anomalies. Their image creates a protective shield, making criticism seem like a glitch in an otherwise polished record. Cognitive dissonance also plays a crucial role. When we invest our admiration in someone, admitting that they might be flawed causes a mental conflict that is hard to resolve. Instead of accepting the discrepancy between their idealized image and their actual behavior, our minds choose to rationalize away the criticism. We might think, well, everyone makes mistakes. Or, they're under immense pressure. This mental maneuver preserves our positive view, reinforcing our positive even in the face of undeniable evidence. This tactic isn't just reserved for the famous. In everyday life, you might notice it in a boss who appears both demanding and inspirational. Picture a manager known for making tough decisions and having a stern demeanor. However, they also throw in moments of unexpected kindness. Perhaps a spontaneous team lunch or a personal word of encouragement during a crisis. Over time, their team comes to see these acts as part of a larger narrative. The manager is simply dedicated to excellence, and any harshness is just a necessary part of pushing everyone to perform better. Even when the manager's decisions seem arbitrary or overly strict, the overall persona remains untouchable because the good moments have been elevated to legendary status. History offers plenty of examples. Consider figures like Steve Jobs, who was notorious for his intense, sometimes abrasive management style, yet is widely revered as a visionary innovator. His public image as a genius, a trailblazer, was so deeply ingrained in public consciousness that criticisms of his interpersonal skills were quickly overshadowed by his revolutionary contributions to technology. Each time a negative story surfaced, it was dismissed as a minor flaw in an otherwise brilliant character. The Teflon persona is not just about deflecting criticism. It's also a tool for control. By cultivating an image that is seemingly infallible, individuals ensure that all future actions, even questionable ones, are seen in the context of an overarching greatness. This self-reinforcing mechanism works like a force field, where each successful deflection of a criticism only adds to the aura of untouchability. The more someone gets away with, the stronger their persona becomes. Over time, even close associates might start dotting their own recollections, preferring to align with the dominant narrative because it's easier and feels safer. In the realm of politics, this tactic is especially potent. A leader who has mastered the art of the Teflon persona can weather scandals, policy failures, and personal attacks by ensuring that their core image, be it of strength, wisdom, or visionary leadership, remains unchallenged. Supporters are quick to reinterpret any misstep as an unfair attack by detractors, preserving the leader's status as untouchable. The manipulation here is subtle yet powerful. By controlling the narrative, the leader not only deflects criticism but also molds public perception to their advantage. So how can you recognize and defend against someone wielding a Teflon persona? The first step is to look beyond the glossy exterior. Separate the carefully curated image from the actual behaviors. Ask probing questions. Does the public image match what you observe behind closed doors? Are there patterns of behavior that are conveniently glossed over by the persona? Critical documentation. Whether it's keeping records of actions, statements, or verified accounts, can help peel back the layers of the persona to reveal the truth beneath. Another key defense is to foster a culture of healthy skepticism. Instead of accepting a clearest image at face value, encourage nuanced discussion about both strengths and weaknesses. When someone's reputation seems too perfect, it's often a sign that you're dealing with a strategic facade designed to deflect accountability. Question who benefits from maintaining that untouchable image. Often, the manipulator's real power lies in their ability to shape perception, rather than in any genuine virtue. Ultimately, the Teflon persona is a sophisticated psychological armor. It transforms criticism into mere background noise, ensuring that even significant flaws never tarnish a well-crafted image. The manipulator's success is measured not by the absence of errors, but by the ability to make errors appear irrelevant. In a world where public opinion can be as malleable as clay, understanding the mechanics behind the Teflon persona is essential. It not only protects those who wield it but also serves as a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. By learning to see past the glitter and into the substance, you empower yourself to hold even the most seemingly untouchable figures accountable. In the end, no matter how slick the image, the truth has a way of resurfacing. And when it does, it's only the vigilant who are ready to confront it head-on. Emotional flooding. Have you ever wondered how cult leaders, master manipulators, and even some of the most cunning salespeople seem to break down even the strongest, willed individuals? It's not magic. It's psychology. Specifically, something called emotional flooding. A dark, powerful technique that overwhelms someone's emotions so intensely that they give in, comply, or even change their beliefs entirely. And what's truly unsettling, this tactic doesn't just work on the weak. It works on everyone, including you. So, what exactly is emotional flooding? In its simplest form, it's the strategic and intentional overload of intense emotions, fear, guilt, love, or confusion, to short-circuit someone's ability to think rationally. When a person is emotionally flooded, their brain shifts from logical, critical thinking to pure survival mode. They become desperate to escape the emotional overload, and that's where the manipulator swoops in with a way out, usually on their terms. Imagine this: you're sitting in an interrogation room. You know you didn't commit a crime, but after hours of relentless questioning, shouting, and emotional pressure, you start doubting your own memories. This isn't hypothetical. It's exactly how false confessions happen. A famous example: the Central Park 5 case. 5 teenagers were interrogated for hours, emotionally overwhelmed, and eventually confessed to crimes they didn't commit, even though they were innocent. Why? Because emotional flooding breaks the mind's natural defenses. It replaces facts with feelings, and the dominant feeling is "make this stop." But it's not just law enforcement that uses this. Cults master emotional flooding to recruit and retain followers. Take the infamous Jonestown massacre led by Jim Jones. Survivors reported that Jones would orchestrate long, exhausting sermons filled with emotional highs and crushing lows. One moment, he'd promise a utopia of love and acceptance. The next, he'd accuse followers of betrayal, scream about impending doom, and punish those who questioned him. This roller coaster of emotions created an environment where people's critical thinking was drowned by fear, guilt, and hope. Once emotionally flooded, they clung to Jones, the only person who seemed to offer stability amid the chaos he created. It's all rooted in psychology. When emotions overwhelm us, our brain's amygdala, the center for processing emotions like fear and aggression, hijacks the prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning and decision-making. This is known as amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman. In this state, people make impulsive, irrational decisions just to escape the emotional pain. They stop questioning the source of the pain and instead seek relief, even if it means agreeing to something they normally wouldn't. Let's take a more everyday example. Picture a toxic relationship where one partner uses emotional flooding to control the other. It starts small, maybe an argument over a misunderstanding. But then, the manipulative partner escalates. They cry, scream, blame, accuse, and guilt trip relentlessly, sometimes for hours. The overwhelmed partner becomes emotionally exhausted. They stop defending themselves, apologize for things they didn't do, or agree to unreasonable demands. Not because they believe they're wrong, but because they want the emotional flood to stop. Over time, this dynamic can erode their confidence, identity, and autonomy. Even in business, emotional flooding is a go-to strategy for high-pressure sales. Ever sat through a timeshare presentation? It starts friendly, but quickly escalates. The sales rep bombards you with dreams of luxury vacations, warnings about missed opportunities, and guilt trips about your family's happiness. They keep you there for hours, without a chance to step away and think. Eventually, people give in, not because they want the timeshare, but because the emotional bombardment is unbearable. They'll sign just to escape the intensity. Research backs this up. In a 2001 study on emotional regulation by Gross and Levinson, participants exposed to prolonged emotional distress showed diminished cognitive control and higher rates of compliance when offered a way to relieve the discomfort. Manipulators instinctively use this to their advantage. They overwhelm, then offer a way out. But why does this work so consistently? It taps into one of the most primal human instincts: avoidance of pain. Emotional flooding creates unbearable emotional pain, fear, shame, or guilt, and the person experiencing it will do almost anything to make it stop. And here's the kicker: once the emotional flooding ends, the relief feels so profound that the person often associates the manipulator with that relief, even though they were the source of the pain to begin with. It's twisted, but effective. So, what's the takeaway? Emotional flooding is one of the most effective and sinister manipulation tactics out there. And it works because it hijacks the brain's emotional systems, replacing logic with desperation. Whether it's an interrogator extracting a false confession, a cult leader breaking down followers, a toxic partner asserting control, or a high-pressure salesperson closing a deal, the pattern is the same. Overload the emotions, short-circuit rational thought, then present a way out. The scary part: once you recognize emotional flooding, you start to see it everywhere. In relationships, politics, sales, even social media outrage cycles. But knowledge is power. Now that you understand the mechanics, you're one step closer to recognizing when it's happening to you and breaking free before you drown in it. The contrast principle: imagine walking into a car dealership, and the first car they show you is a top-of-the-line luxury model. Leather seats, premium sound system, every feature you could dream of, and a price tag to match $80,000. You wince, knowing it's way out of your budget. Then, the salesman smiles and says, "Let me show you something else." He walks you over to another car, still nice but simpler. It's $45,000. Suddenly, that second car feels like a bargain, even though it's still a hefty price. This is the contrast principle. A dark psychology trick so powerful it can make you believe you're getting a good deal, agreeing to a bad relationship, or even supporting an idea you would normally reject. And the scary part: it works without you even noticing. So what exactly is the contrast principle? In simple terms, it's the psychological phenomenon where our brain doesn't judge things on their own. It judges them relative to what came before. Something can seem better, cheaper, more attractive, or more reasonable, not because it actually is, but because it's compared to something worse. Let's break this down. Imagine someone hands you a bucket of ice water, freezing cold. After holding it for a minute, they swap it out for room temperature water. That room temperature water suddenly feels warm, even though it's not. Your body isn't judging the water's temperature objectively. It's reacting based on the cold bucket you held first. The same thing happens with decisions. When you're shown an extreme option first, like an overpriced car, an awful job, or a toxic relationship, anything that follows feels better, even if it's still not great. Salespeople are masters of this. Robert Cialdini, one of the leading experts in persuasion, described this in his book Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. He observed that real estate agents would first show clients run-down, overpriced homes, deliberately. These were never meant to sell. Their purpose: to make the next, slightly less awful house look like a dream come true. Clothing stores do this too. Ever noticed how high-end stores place their $500 jackets right at the front? After seeing that, a $120 sweater feels like a steal, even though you might have never considered spending that much on a sweater in the first place. It's not just sales. The contrast principle infiltrates our personal lives, too. Let's talk relationships. If you've ever dated someone toxic, controlling, or manipulative, you might find yourself falling for the next person who's merely decent, but they feel amazing by comparison. Maybe they're still emotionally unavailable or incompatible with you, but compared to your last relationship, they seem like a saint. This even happens in job offers. Picture this: you get a lowball offer from Company A. It's insulting, and you're ready to walk away. Then Company B swoops in with an offer that's only slightly better. But now, it feels like a win. You're grateful to Company B, even though their offer might still be under your true worth. Why does this work so consistently? It all comes down to how our brains process information. Human perception relies heavily on relativity. We're wired to compare things instead of evaluating them in isolation. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist and author of Thinking, Fast and Slow, explains this as part of System 1 thinking, the brain's fast, instinctive, and emotional mode. When faced with comparisons, System 1 takes shortcuts. It doesn't ask, "Is this good?" It asks, "Is this better than what I just saw?" The contrast principle even manipulates how we see people. Ever notice how someone seems more attractive when they're standing next to someone less attractive? That's not your imagination. A study published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology found that people rated others as more attractive when they were viewed alongside less attractive individuals. Your brain automatically compares, and the better option shines. This tactic is also rampant in politics and media. If a politician wants to push an extreme policy, they might first introduce an even more radical one, knowing it'll be rejected. When they propose their actual plan next, it feels reasonable by comparison. It's the same with news stories. After hearing about a devastating tragedy, a less severe one feels almost like good news. But here's the real kicker. The contrast principle doesn't just influence what we choose. It affects how we feel about those choices. When you buy that cheaper car, after seeing the expensive one first, you don't feel tricked. You feel smart, like you found a great deal, even though the dealer orchestrated that feeling from the start. So how do you protect yourself from falling for this psychological trap? First, pause before deciding. If you ever feel like you're rushing into a choice because it feels better than the last option, stop. Ask yourself, do I actually want this? Or does it just seem better by comparison? Second, evaluate things on their own merit. Strip away the comparisons. Would you still buy that $45,000 car if you hadn't seen the $80,000 one first? Would that job still excite you if the lowball offer hadn't come first? Third, recognize when someone might be using this against you. Whether it's a salesperson, a partner, or a politician, pay attention when the first option you're shown is intentionally awful. That's a red flag. The contrast principle is everywhere, from sales floors to relationships to politics. And once you recognize it, you'll start seeing it in places you never expected. But now, you won't fall for it. Because you'll know the truth, the second option isn't always better. Sometimes, it just looks that way. Familiarity Heuristic. Did you know that the more you hear a lie, the more likely you are to believe it, even if you know it's false? That's not a flaw in your thinking. It's a built-in shortcut your brain relies on to make sense of the world. It's called the Familiarity Heuristic, and once you see how it works, you'll realize just how often it's used against you. The Familiarity Heuristic is your brain's way of saving energy. It's a mental shortcut where we assume that if something feels familiar, it must be true, or at least safer and more reliable than something unfamiliar. This happens because our brains equate ease of processing with correctness. If an idea is easier to recall or recognize, we're more likely to trust it. It feels right, even if it isn't. Think about slogan from major brands. Just do it. I'm loving it. Or, have it your way. You've heard them so many times they feel like facts, not marketing. But this goes way deeper than catchy jingles. One of the most famous studies on this effect was conducted by psychologists Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Tapino in 1977. They showed participants a list of statements over several sessions. Some were true, some were false. But the key was that certain statements repeated across the sessions. By the end of the study, participants rated the repeated statements as more believable, even if they were completely false. The repetition alone made them feel true. This is why propaganda works. Political slogans, social media rumors, and even gossip in your friend group, they all use this principle. When you hear something over and over, it becomes mentally sticky. Your brain doesn't bother to question it as much anymore. It slides right into the probably true category, purely because it's familiar. Here's where it gets even scarier. The familiarity heuristic doesn't just make us believe lies, it makes us defend them. Once a false idea feels true, it becomes part of our mental framework. We resist letting it go because it feels comfortable. Cognitive dissonance kicks in. The uncomfortable mental tension when new information conflicts with what we already believe. And our brain's solution is to reject the new info, not the familiar one. It's easier that way. A real-world example. The infamous vaccines cause autism myth. This idea came from a now debunked study by Andrew Wakefield in 1998. The study was small, flawed, and later retracted, but the damage was done. The claim was repeated endlessly in media interviews and social circles. People heard it so often that it felt true. Even after mountains of scientific evidence disproved it, the myth persisted. It still lingers today because repetition made it emotionally familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. Marketers exploit this too. Ever noticed how the same product ads seem to follow you everywhere? On your feed, your YouTube recommendations, even other websites. That's not an accident. That's deliberate repetition. They're using familiarity to lower your resistance. By the 5th or 6th time you see that product, it doesn't feel like an ad anymore. It feels like a suggestion from an old friend. But here's the kicker: this trick doesn't just apply to ideas. It works on people, too. Psychologists call this the mere exposure effect. The more you see someone, the more likable they seem, even if you never actually interact with them. It's why news anchors, influencers, and celebrities feel strangely familiar, like you know them personally. It's also why politicians flood your screen during election season. They're not just asking for your vote. They're embedding themselves into your brain, making you feel like you trust them, even if you don't know why. Take the 2016 U.S. presidential election. One study from media analysts found that Donald Trump received an unprecedented amount of media coverage. Far more than his opponents. Whether the coverage was positive or negative didn't matter. The sheer volume of exposure made him a household name. He became familiar. And familiarity, thanks to the heuristic, breeds trust. Or at least a feeling that he was a known quantity compared to other candidates. So, what's the takeaway here? First, recognize that repetition is a powerful tool, but it's not always working in your favor. When you hear something over and over, stop and ask, do I believe this because it's true? Or because it feels true? Second, if you want to protect yourself from this manipulation, diversify your information sources. If you only hear from the same voices, you're reinforcing their messages. Even if they're wrong, seek out opposing viewpoints. Make your brain work harder. It's uncomfortable, but that discomfort is a sign you're thinking critically, not just following the path of least resistance. And lastly, if you ever need to convince someone of something, you now understand one of the most potent tools in the psychological arsenal. Repetition isn't just persuasive, it's transformational. Use it carefully, because once an idea takes root through familiarity, it's nearly impossible to shake. The familiarity heuristic isn't just a mental shortcut, it's a weapon. And now, you know how it works? Proteus Effect. What if I told you that changing the way someone sees themselves, even just a little, could completely reshape how they act? It's not science fiction. It's called the Proteus Effect, and once you understand it, you'll see how easy it is to nudge people's behavior without them even realizing it. The Proteus Effect gets its name from the Greek god Proteus, who could change his form at will. In psychology, it describes how people's behavior adapts to match the identity or appearance they're given, even when that identity isn't real. The concept was first studied in virtual environments. In 2007, researchers Nick Yee and Jeremy Bailenson from Stanford University ran an experiment using avatars in virtual reality. Participants were given digital bodies that looked different from their real selves. Some taller, more attractive, or even of a different gender. What happened? People's behavior changed dramatically to match their new appearance. People with taller avatars became more assertive in negotiations. Those with more attractive avatars acted more confidently. They weren't consciously pretending. Their subconscious minds adapted to the persona they were seeing. Here's where it gets interesting. The Proteus Effect doesn't just apply to virtual worlds. It works in the real world, too, and it's exploited more often than you think. Take clothing, for example. Studies show that when people wear formal attire, they perform better on cognitive tests and negotiate more effectively. Why? Because wearing a suit doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. You feel more powerful, and you act more powerful. The same happens with uniforms. Put on a lab coat, and you start thinking more analytically. Wear a military uniform, and you feel more disciplined. The clothing creates a new identity, and your behavior follows. Marketers and social media influencers understand this effect well. Ever noticed how certain brands sell more than just products? They sell a lifestyle, an identity. Apple isn't just selling a phone, they're selling the image of creativity and innovation. When you buy that iPhone, you're not just buying a device, you're buying into that persona. You start to see yourself as part of that world, and you behave accordingly. You feel more tech-savvy, more stylish, more ahead of the curve. The same principle is weaponized in politics. Leaders carefully craft not just their own image, but the image they want their supporters to adopt. They create a collective identity, a group persona. Suddenly, it's not just about supporting a candidate, it's about being a patriot, a fighter, a rebel against the system. People take on that identity, and their behavior follows. They become more vocal, more aggressive, more loyal, because to act otherwise feels like betraying who they've become. And it doesn't stop there. The Proteus Effect plays a huge role in social media. Ever noticed how people curate their profiles to look a certain way? Happier, more successful, more adventurous than they really are. The surprising part is that this doesn't just fool their followers. It fools them. Studies show that people start to internalize their online personas. If someone builds an image of being confident and outgoing, they start to feel and act that way in real life. Even if they weren't like that before. The identity becomes reality. But here's the dark side: the Proteus Effect isn't always positive. It can be used to trap people in destructive behaviors. If someone is repeatedly labeled as lazy, stupid, or worthless by others or even themselves, they start to embody that persona. They believe it, and their actions follow suit. This is why bullying and negative reinforcement are so powerful. They don't just hurt feelings, they rewire self-perception. And once someone's self-image shifts, it's incredibly hard to reverse. So how do you protect yourself from this kind of manipulation? First, recognize when someone is trying to shape your identity. Whether it's an ad, a leader, or even your social circle. Ask yourself, am I adopting this persona because I believe in it, or because it's been planted in me? Second, take control of your own Proteus Effect. Choose the identities you want to embody. Want to be more confident? Dress like it. Speak like it. Create that version of yourself, and watch your behavior follow. The Proteus Effect isn't just a psychological quirk. It's a blueprint for reshaping behavior. Yours and everyone else's. And now that you understand it, you're holding the blueprint in your hands. Preemptive guilt. What if I told you that you could control someone's behavior? Not by punishing them after they do something wrong, but by making them feel guilty before they even act. This psychological weapon is called preemptive guilt. And once you understand how it works, you'll start to notice it everywhere. Preemptive guilt works by planting an emotional seed, a feeling that someone's future actions might hurt, disappoint, or betray others. It doesn't matter if they haven't done anything yet. The point is to make them feel bad about even considering the action. And once that guilt takes hold, people will often change their behavior just to avoid the discomfort. Let's break it down. Humans are wired for empathy and social belonging. In fact, one of the strongest emotional drivers we have is the desire to be seen as good by others and by ourselves. Guilt hijacks that desire. It's the emotional pain that comes from believing we've fallen short of those expectations. But here's the twist: guilt doesn't actually need a real offense to work. All it needs is the anticipation of wrongdoing. That's where preemptive guilt strikes. Parents instinctively use this all the time. And for good reason. Imagine a mom saying, "You wouldn't want to make grandma sad by skipping her birthday, would you?" The child hasn't even made a decision yet, but the guilt is already there, shaping their choices before they've had a chance to think freely. It's not a punishment for skipping grandma's birthday. It's the fear of causing sadness that does the heavy lifting, and it's not just parents. Marketers are masters of this tactic too. Ever seen a charity ad that says, "How can you enjoy your dinner tonight when children are starving?" You weren't doing anything wrong, but suddenly, you feel like you are. The guilt pushes you toward donating, not because you planned to, but because now you feel like a bad person if you don't. Politicians? They're no strangers to this either. If you don't vote, you're letting your country down. The message isn't about empowering you to vote. It's about making you feel guilty. If you even think about staying home, they don't need to persuade you that voting is good. They only need you to feel like not voting is unforgivable. Social dynamics are another breeding ground for preemptive guilt. Think about phrases like, "If you were a real friend, you'd come support me," or, "A good partner wouldn't even think about doing that." These statements don't criticize behavior. They target identity. They force you to prove you're a good friend, a loyal partner, a decent person. And the only way to prove it is to comply. But here's where it gets darker. Preemptive guilt can be weaponized to trap people in toxic relationships. Romantic, professional, or even family-based. A manipulative partner might say, "If you really loved me, you wouldn't even want to go out with your friends tonight." Now, the guilt isn't just about the action. It's about what that action supposedly reveals about your character. You're not just someone who wants to see your friends. You're now someone who doesn't care enough about their partner. The truth. This is emotional blackmail wrapped in a moral disguise. The goal isn't to persuade. It's to control. So how do you defend yourself against preemptive guilt? First, recognize it when it happens. Ask yourself, am I feeling guilty because I genuinely believe I'm doing something wrong? Or because someone planted that guilt to steer me? If the guilt appeared before you even made a decision, that's a red flag. Second, reframe the narrative. Remember that guilt doesn't equal truth. Just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you are guilty. Reflect on your values and intentions, not on the emotional pressure someone else is applying. Finally, if you're ever in a situation where someone's trying to control you with preemptive guilt, turn the script around. Calmly but firmly. A response like, "I care about you, but I also need to make decisions that are right for me," breaks the guilt cycle without escalating the situation. Preemptive guilt isn't just a clever emotional trick. It's a psychological leash. And now that you understand how it works, you can recognize it, break free from it, and make sure no one ever uses it against you again. The Ben Franklin effect. Asking someone for a favor can actually make them like you more. It sounds backwards. Wouldn't doing favors for others be the way to earn their affection? Psychology says otherwise. This phenomenon is a fascinating mental twist called the Ben Franklin effect. It's rooted in how our brains justify our own actions, and once you understand it, you'll never see social interactions the same way again. The Ben Franklin effect gets its name from, you guessed it, Ben Franklin himself. He once wrote about a clever strategy he used to turn a political rival into an ally. Franklin needed to win over a man who outright disliked him. Instead of trying to charm him with gifts or compliments, Franklin did the opposite. He asked the man for a favor, specifically, to lend him a rare book. Surprisingly, the rival agreed. After returning the book with a gracious thank you, Franklin noticed the man's attitude completely shifted. They became friends. Why? Because the man's mind had to rationalize the favor he had done. Here's the kicker: when someone does a favor for you, even if they originally didn't like you, their brain experiences a sort of cognitive dissonance. This is a psychological tension that happens when our actions contradict our feelings. The brain doesn't like this discomfort, so it rewrites the narrative. If I help this person, I must like them. It's the same mental gymnastics that make people double down on decisions they're unsure of. Once you invest time, energy, or resources into something, your brain convinces you that the choice was right all along. A 1969 study by psychologists John Jecker and David Landy tested this effect. Participants were split into 3 groups after winning a small sum of money. One group was asked by the experimenter to return the money as a personal favor to him. Another group was asked to return the money as a favor to the psychology department. The third group wasn't asked for anything. The people who did the personal favor for the experimenter ended up liking him significantly more than the other groups did. Their brains had to justify why they went out of their way for him. And the answer was, subconsciously, I must like this person. This isn't just a neat psychological quirk. It's a powerful tool that shapes relationships, even when people have no idea it's happening. A new coworker seems cold toward you. Instead of trying to win them over with compliments or favors, ask them for a small favor, like borrowing a pen or helping with a minor task. They comply. Now, their brain is stuck reconciling why they helped someone they supposedly didn't like. The easiest explanation. I guess they're not so bad after all. It's not just about making friends, though. The Ben Franklin effect plays out on bigger scales, too. Salespeople often use it without even realizing it. Car dealerships might ask you to fill out a quick survey, or a store asks you to try a free sample. These aren't random gestures. They're calculated steps to get you to engage in a small act of compliance. Once you've given a little time or effort, you're more likely to continue the relationship, maybe even with a purchase. Your mind says, I already engaged with this brand. I must like it. Even politicians tap into this psychological lever. Campaigns often start by asking for small commitments, like signing a petition or pledging support, before they ask for donations or votes. The idea is to get you to perform a minor act that aligns with supporting them. From there, your brain's built-in need for consistency takes over. I already helped them once. I must agree with their message. But what happens when the roles reverse? If you're constantly the one doing favors for someone else without asking for anything back, you might actually make it harder for them to like you. Why? Because their brain doesn't need to justify liking you. You've already given them the reward without any mental effort on their part. The effect works best when they invest in you first. The takeaway here. The next time you meet someone you want to win over, whether it's a potential friend, a boss, or even someone who doesn't like you yet, resist the urge to impress them with generosity. Instead, start small and ask them for something easy to give. It could be advice, a quick favor, or even just borrowing something trivial. Their brain will do the hard work of convincing them to like you. It's a psychological trick that's been working since Ben Franklin's time. And it's still just as powerful today. Forced polarization. People like to think they're rational, that they form opinions based on facts and make decisions from a balanced perspective. But what if the easiest way to control someone wasn't to convince them you're right, but to push them so far to one side that they can't imagine being wrong? This is the essence of forced polarization, a psychological trick that manipulates people by driving them to extremes. Forced polarization works by exploiting a cognitive bias called group polarization. It's been studied extensively in social psychology, and the findings are unsettling. When people discuss an issue with like-minded individuals, they don't become more moderate, they become more extreme. It's not just about agreeing more strongly, their entire mindset shifts to a more radical version of their initial belief. One famous study, conducted in 1975 by researchers Serge Moscovici and Marisa Zavalloni, demonstrated this effect. When participants discussed their opinions on a political figure in a group, their collective stance intensified. Positive opinions became more glowing, while negative ones grew harsher. The group didn't just reach a consensus. They escalated toward the extreme ends of the spectrum. This tendency isn't accidental. It's rooted in two psychological forces: social comparison and persuasive arguments. Social comparison drives people to align with the group, but also to prove they're more committed than others, leading to a competitive race toward the extreme. Meanwhile, persuasive arguments reinforce existing beliefs, making the extreme position feel more justified and logical. So, how does this become a tool for control? It's remarkably simple. If you want people to follow your lead without question, you don't need to convince them you're the most reasonable option. You just need to convince them that the other side is unthinkable. Politicians and media outlets do this all the time. By portraying the opposing side as dangerous, immoral, or downright evil, they push their audience deeper into their own camp. The more extreme people become, the less they question their own leaders. Political campaigns are a prime example. Rather than spending all their energy promoting their own policies, candidates often focus on demonizing the opposition. The goal isn't just to persuade, it's to radicalize. When voters see the other side as an existential threat, they stop evaluating their own side's flaws. Loyalty becomes less about agreement and more about survival. This tactic extends far beyond politics. Brands and influencers play into polarization too. Apple vs Android, Coke vs Pepsi, X vs PlayStation. Companies foster fanatical loyalty by stoking rivalry. It's not enough to prefer one brand. You're encouraged to believe the alternative is inferior, outdated, or even stupid. The result: consumers defend their chosen brand like a badge of honor, reinforcing their emotional commitment with every argument. Even cults and authoritarian regimes rely on forced polarization. They create an us vs them mentality, where outsiders are portrayed as dangerous enemies. This forces followers to cling tighter to the group, because leaving no longer feels like a choice. It feels like betrayal or self-destruction. The chilling part is how easily this process can start. A single, emotionally charged headline, a carefully worded speech, a viral social media post that mocks or vilifies the other side. Each piece fuels the divide, nudging people closer to the edge. And the further they go, the harder it becomes to turn back. Research supports this too. A 2016 study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that social media algorithms unintentionally promote polarization by feeding users more content that aligns with their existing beliefs. Over time, people's views become more extreme, and their willingness to engage with opposing ideas shrinks. The echo chamber builds itself. What makes forced polarization even more powerful is the emotional charge behind it. People are more likely to act, and act aggressively, when they feel threatened. By painting the other side as a threat, manipulators tap into primal emotions like fear and anger. This overrides rational thought, making people defend their side at any cost. So, what's the takeaway? If you ever find yourself feeling unusually angry, defensive, or convinced that one side is completely right and the other is irredeemably wrong, pause. Ask yourself who benefits from you feeling that way. Forced polarization isn't just a psychological trick, it's a tool of control. And the moment you recognize it, you take back the power they tried to steal. The placebo effect. Imagine convincing someone that something works, even when it objectively shouldn't, and watching it actually work for them anyway. That's the power of the placebo effect, one of psychology's strangest and most powerful tricks. It's not just about sugar pills and fake treatments. It's about how belief alone can rewire someone's mind and body. The placebo effect is a psychological and physiological phenomenon where people experience real improvements in pain, mood, or even physical function from a treatment that has no active ingredients. They aren't getting better because the treatment works. They're getting better because they believe it works. Their mind fills in the gaps, and their body follows suit. The roots of the placebo effect trace back centuries, but the first modern scientific studies on it emerged during World War II. An American anesthesiologist named Henry Beecher witnessed something remarkable on the battlefield. With morphine supplies running dangerously low, nurses began injecting wounded soldiers with saline solution, telling them it was a powerful painkiller. Astonishingly, many soldiers stopped feeling pain. Beecher later described this phenomenon in a 1955 paper titled The Powerful Placebo, kickstarting decades of research. So, what's actually happening here? It's not just wishful thinking. The placebo effect has a biological basis. Studies using brain scans have shown that when people believe they're receiving effective treatment, their brain releases endorphins, the body's natural painkillers. Dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with reward and pleasure, also spikes. This chemical reaction can reduce pain, improve mood, and even influence heart rate and blood pressure. A 2001 study published in Science demonstrated this with Parkinson's disease patients. Researchers gave patients a placebo, telling them it was an effective new drug. Brain scans revealed that patients who believed they received the drug showed increased dopamine production, something that typically requires actual medication. Their bodies responded as if they had been treated, all because they thought they had. The effect doesn't stop with pain relief. Placebos have been shown to improve symptoms in conditions like depression, anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, and even migraines. A 2014 study in the Journal of Pain found that placebo treatments were about 50% as effective as real painkillers for relieving migraines. Not because the sugar pill did anything, but because patients believed it would help. What's even crazier? Placebos can still work even when people know they're placebos. A groundbreaking 2010 study from Harvard Medical School gave patients with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, open-label placebos, meaning they were told up front they were getting sugar pills with no active ingredients. Surprisingly, these patients still reported significant symptom improvement compared to those who got no treatment at all. The explanation: the act of taking a pill, paired with the doctor's reassurance that this has been shown to help people, was enough to trigger the brain's healing response. The placebo effect also ties into a psychological concept called expectancy theory. This theory suggests that when people expect a specific outcome, like feeling better, their brain unconsciously helps bring that outcome to life. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy where belief shapes reality. But here's where things get dark. The placebo effect doesn't just apply to healing. It can be weaponized. Think about how marketers push products that promise impossible results: miracle weight loss pills, anti-aging creams, or performance-boosting supplements. Even if the product itself is useless, the belief that it works can create a placebo effect strong enough to convince people it's worth their money. Scammers and con artists rely on this too. Psychics, faith healers, and alternative medicine peddlers often tap into the placebo effect without even knowing it. They build trust and set high expectations, and the mind does the rest. It's not that their methods have any real power, it's that the belief they inspire triggers genuine psychological and physical changes. Even in relationships and social dynamics, the placebo effect sneaks in. Have you ever had someone give you a confidence boost, like a compliment before a big meeting, and suddenly you perform better? That's the placebo effect in action. Your belief in yourself skyrockets because someone planted the idea that you're capable, and your mind works overtime to live up to that belief. The military has experimented with this too. There's a theory that elite training programs, like those for Navy SEALs, incorporate subtle placebo effects. Instructors push recruits to their physical and mental limits while reinforcing the belief that they're stronger and tougher than they realize. This conditioning helps recruits tap into reserves of strength they didn't know they had, because they believe they can. On the flip side, the placebo effect has an evil twin, the nocebo effect. This happens when negative expectations cause harm instead of healing. If someone believes a harmless pill will cause side effects, they might start experiencing them anyway. Headaches, nausea, fatigue. Even though the pill is just sugar, the mind can create suffering just as easily as it creates relief. So, what's the big takeaway? The placebo effect isn't just about fake medicine. It's about how powerful belief itself can be. Whether it's a sugar pill, a motivational speech, or a cleverly marketed product, people's minds are wired to turn expectations into reality. The next time someone convinces you something works, or doesn't, ask yourself, is it the product, or is it your belief doing the heavy lifting? Because once you understand the placebo effect, you start to realize that sometimes the most powerful tool of all is the one inside your head. The gray rock method, it sounds dull, lifeless, and unremarkable. And that's exactly the point. This psychological strategy is designed to protect you from emotional manipulators, narcissists, and toxic people, not by fighting back, but by becoming so boring and unresponsive that they lose interest and move on. It's about depriving them of what they crave most, your emotional energy. So, how does this method work, and why is it so effective? Let's break it down. Manipulators, especially narcissists and sociopaths, thrive on emotional reactions. Whether it's anger, sadness, fear, or even affection, they feed off the energy you give them. This isn't always conscious on their part. It's more like an instinct. The more emotionally invested you become, the more control they have. They push your buttons to keep you engaged, because as long as you're reacting, they're winning. The gray rock method flips the script. Instead of providing that emotional fuel, you become as uninteresting and detached as possible, like a literal gray rock. You stop offering any emotional reactions, making yourself an unsatisfying target. The idea is rooted in basic behavioral psychology, specifically, extinction, a concept from operant conditioning. Extinction happens when a behavior stops being reinforced. If someone's used to getting a payoff, like attention or emotional reactions, and suddenly they get nothing, they eventually stop trying. The behavior dies out. Picture this: a narcissist thrives on provoking you into defending yourself, explaining, apologizing, or exploding with anger. Every reaction you give is a reward, a sign that they still have power over you. But if you stop giving them anything, no arguments, no explanations, no emotional pushback, they're left with nothing to latch onto. It's like trying to start a fire with wet wood. Let's look at an example. Imagine you're dealing with a manipulative coworker who loves to provoke you. They make a passive-aggressive comment about your work in front of the team, clearly trying to get under your skin. Normally, you might defend yourself or snap back, and that's exactly what they want. But if you gray rock instead, you respond with something dull and neutral like, okay, or, no emotion, no reaction. Just bland, uninteresting calm. They're left with nothing to feed on. What's happening behind the scenes is even more interesting. A 2011 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that emotional responses, especially negative ones, strengthen social bonds, even in toxic relationships. When you stop reacting emotionally, you disrupt that bond. The manipulator loses the unconscious reward of your distress, and their brain starts to associate you with boredom rather than excitement. The gray rock method isn't just about words. It's about your entire presence. Your tone, body language, and even facial expressions should all communicate disinterest. Keep responses short, factual, and monotone. Avoid sharing personal details or opinions. If they ask how your day was, you say, "It was fine." If they press for more, you stick to basic facts. "I worked. It was busy." No elaboration, no emotional color. But this approach isn't just psychological. It's neurological. Brain imaging studies have shown that emotional responses activate the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing emotions like fear and anger. When you stay calm and neutral, you deprive the manipulator's brain of that emotional stimulation, making the interaction unsatisfying. Now, let's talk about the trap. Gray rocking sounds simple, but it's deceptively hard, especially when you're dealing with someone who knows how to push your buttons. They might escalate their behavior, trying harder to provoke a reaction. This is called an extinction burst, a last-ditch effort to get the reward they're used to. It's the same thing that happens when a child throws a bigger tantrum after you stop giving them attention. This is where emotional discipline becomes crucial. If you break and give in, even once, you reset the cycle. The manipulator learns that if they push hard enough, you'll crack. That's why consistency is everything. You have to be prepared for their behavior to get worse before it gets better. Another risk: becoming too robotic. The goal isn't to alienate healthy relationships or lose your humanity. You're not supposed to become a gray rock to everyone, only to the person targeting you. With friends, family, and people who genuinely care about you, it's important to keep being your authentic self. One more thing: the gray rock method isn't a permanent solution. It's a defense mechanism, not a way to live forever. Over time, a manipulator might lose interest, but they may also escalate to more harmful tactics. That's why this method works best as a short-term strategy, giving you space to plan a safer exit or establish stronger boundaries. So, what's the takeaway? The gray rock method is about reclaiming control by becoming uncontrollable. It's about recognizing that sometimes the best way to win isn't by fighting. It's by becoming so boring, so unengaging, that the manipulator has no choice but to move on in search of an easier target. At the end of the day, manipulators are like emotional parasites. They need your energy to survive. But if you stop feeding them, they starve. And that's where you find your freedom. The red herring trick: it's a manipulation tactic as old as time, yet so effective that even the most intelligent people fall for it, without realizing what's happening. At its core, this trick is about distraction. It's the art of diverting someone's attention away from the real issue and onto something irrelevant, something emotionally charged or seemingly urgent, so they stop focusing on what actually matters. Let's break this down. The phrase, red herring, originally comes from the practice of using strong, smelling fish to throw hunting dogs off a trail. In psychological terms, it works the same way a manipulator creates a false trail, something so compelling or inflammatory that you can't help but follow it. Meanwhile, the truth slips away unnoticed. This tactic relies heavily on the brain's natural response to emotional stimuli. Research shows that when we're emotionally provoked, especially by fear, anger, or moral outrage, the logical parts of our brain take a back seat. A 2009 study, published in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, found that strong emotional reactions can actually suppress activity in the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and decision-making. In other words, when you're emotionally distracted, you're easier to manipulate. One classic example of the red herring trick is in politics. Imagine a politician facing accusations of corruption. Instead of addressing the allegations directly, they point to a completely unrelated but emotionally charged issue, say, national security, immigration, or a scandal involving their opponent. Suddenly, the headlines shift. People stop talking about corruption and start arguing over the new topic. The original issue gets buried, and the politician walks away with their reputation largely intact. This tactic isn't limited to politics. It's everywhere. In relationships, the workplace, even sales and marketing. Let's say your partner forgets an important event. When you confront them, they flip the script. Why are you always so negative? You never appreciate what I do for you. Now you're on the defensive, arguing about your negativity instead of their forgetfulness. That's a red herring in action. The original issue is completely sidestepped, and the emotional detour leaves you too flustered to get back to it. Companies use this trick too. Ever notice how when a big corporation faces a PR disaster, they suddenly announce a heartwarming charity campaign or a new, exciting product launch? It's not a coincidence. It's a deliberate distraction to shift public focus away from the scandal and onto something that sparks positive emotions instead. The red herring trick can also be weaponized in arguments. Picture this: you're in a debate about climate change. Your opponent, losing ground on the facts, suddenly says, "Well, what about the starving children in other countries? Shouldn't we focus on helping them first?" It's an emotionally loaded point, and one that has nothing to do with the original discussion. But now, if you don't address the starving children, you look heartless, even though the topic was never about that. So why does this tactic work so well? It boils down to how our brains prioritize information. Humans evolved to focus on threats and emotionally charged stimuli, things that could impact survival. A manipulator exploits this by creating an emotional decoy, hijacking your brain's attention system. The more outrageous or dramatic the distraction, the harder it is to ignore. A particularly infamous example: the Watergate scandal. When the Nixon administration got caught in a web of illegal activity, they pushed a series of unrelated narratives, suggesting the media had a personal vendetta, accusing political rivals of worse behavior, and even implying national security was at risk if the truth came out. Each of these was designed to muddy the waters and exhaust the public's attention. By the time the truth was undeniable, the narrative was so tangled that many people stopped caring altogether. But here's the dark twist: the red herring trick doesn't just distract, it also exhausts you. It's designed to wear you down emotionally. Each new dramatic turn drains your mental energy, leaving you too fatigued to keep questioning the original issue. This is called decision fatigue, a phenomenon where prolonged cognitive effort leads to poorer decision making and a higher chance of giving up altogether. Studies show that when people are bombarded with too many choices or conflicting information, they default to the easiest path, often accepting whatever narrative is most convenient. So, how do you defend yourself against this psychological smokescreen? First, recognize the pattern. If an argument or situation suddenly veers into emotionally charged but unrelated territory, stop and ask yourself, is this relevant to the original point? If the answer is no, don't engage with the distraction. Stay anchored to the core issue. Second, slow things down. Emotional manipulation works best when you're rushed and overwhelmed. Take a step back, breathe, and give yourself time to think. The less reactive you are, the harder you are to manipulate. Finally, ask questions, especially ones that circle back to the original topic. For example, if someone tries to derail you with an emotional tangent, calmly respond with, "That's interesting, but let's get back to the main point." This forces the conversation away from the distraction and back to what actually matters. The takeaway: the red herring trick is a powerful weapon in the hands of manipulators. It plays on your emotions, diverts your attention, and leaves you too drained to fight back. But once you recognize the tactic, once you see the false trail for what it is, you take back control. Because the truth doesn't disappear just because someone throws a distraction in your path. It's still there, waiting for you to find it. And now, you know exactly how to cut through the noise and stay focused on what really matters. Time constraints. Time constraints are one of the most powerful and manipulative psychological tricks, and chances are you've fallen for this tactic more than once without even realizing it. When someone pressures you to make a decision fast, whether it's a salesperson, a boss, or even a partner, they're hijacking your brain's natural fear of missing out and using it against you. Let's start with why this works. Humans are wired to avoid loss. This is called loss aversion, a principle first studied by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their research found that people fear losing something far more than they enjoy gaining something of equal value. In other words, the pain of losing 100 feels worse than the joy of gaining 100. Manipulators use this against you by introducing a ticking clock, creating an artificial sense of urgency, so you focus more on avoiding loss than making a rational choice. Think about those limited time offer sales. How many times have you seen a countdown timer on an online store, pushing you to buy something immediately? The message is clear: act now, or miss out forever. This technique works because your brain perceives the time limit as a threat. You don't want to lose the deal, so you rush to make a decision without weighing the pros and cons. And most of the time, that timer is fake. E-commerce platforms often reset the clock every time you refresh the page. But the emotional reaction they create is very real. This tactic isn't just for sales, it's everywhere. Car dealerships push today only deals to get you to commit to a big purchase without time to think. Real estate agents claim other buyers are interested in the same house, making you feel like you need to act now or lose your dream home. Even cults and high-pressure organizations use this, demanding recruits commit on the spot to prevent them from reflecting or talking to loved ones. A chilling example of time constraints in action comes from the infamous 1978 Jonestown tragedy, where cult leader Jim Jones pressured his followers into a mass suicide. He created a chaotic, urgent atmosphere, giving them no time to think or question what was happening. While this is an extreme case, the core manipulation is the same. Urgency disables critical thinking. But what's happening in your brain when you're under time pressure? Neuroscientists have found that when people feel rushed, their brains shift from the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking, to the amygdala, which controls fight or flight responses. In survival situations, this is helpful, but when you're deciding whether to buy a limited edition gadget or sign a high-stakes contract, this reaction works against you. You're no longer evaluating logically, you're reacting emotionally. One study from the Journal of Consumer Research found that time pressure causes people to rely more on instinct and less on deliberate analysis. When forced to make rapid choices, participants chose familiar, easier options, even when better alternatives were available. This is called decision simplification, and it's exactly what manipulators want. They push you into a mental corner, where the simplest decision is to agree with whatever they're selling. Let's break this down with a real-world example. Imagine you're at a car dealership. The salesperson says, "This deal's only good until the end of the day. After that, the price goes up." Suddenly, your brain isn't evaluating the car's quality, reliability, or whether you even need a new car. It's fixated on avoiding the loss. You don't want to miss the deal, so you commit. A week later, you find out the dealership runs that same one-day sale every weekend. Time constraints are especially effective in personal relationships, too. Ever had someone push you for a quick decision in an argument? If you really love me, you'll decide right now. It's the same trick, creating a false sense of urgency to bypass your rational thought process and trap you into a commitment. Even job offers come wrapped in this manipulation. You get the call, "We need your answer by tomorrow." You might feel pressured to accept, worried you won't get another opportunity. But in reality, many employers expect negotiation, and the sudden deadline is often just a tactic to keep you from exploring other offers. So how do you defend yourself against this psychological ambush? First, recognize the tactic. If someone's pushing you to decide quickly, stop and ask yourself why. Are they genuinely helping you, or are they trying to manipulate you? Legitimate opportunities rarely require instant decisions. Second, slow things down. One powerful response is, "I need more time to think about this." It puts the control back in your hands. Manipulators hate this. They want you to panic and comply, not reflect and resist. Third, reframe the fear. Remember, the threat of missing out is often exaggerated or completely fabricated. That on-time offer is probably coming back next week. The job offer. If they truly want you, they'll wait another day. The truth is, time constraints are effective because they exploit your brain's wiring. But once you spot the trick, you pull the rug out from under the manipulator. The next time someone tries to rush you, don't ask yourself, what if I miss out? Ask yourself, why do they need me to decide so fast? Because when you slow down the clock, you take back the power. The Endowment Effect. The Endowment Effect is one of the sneakiest, most powerful psychological tricks, and it's likely controlling you more than you realize. It's the reason you overvalue your old, beat-up car. It's why you refuse to throw away that ugly sweater from your grandma. And it's how businesses, marketers, and even manipulators exploit your mind to get what they want. Let's break this trick down. The endowment effect is a cognitive bias where people place a higher value on things simply because they own them. In other words, ownership itself inflates value. This idea was first studied by Nobel Prize-winning economist Richard Thaler. He found that once people possess something, even if they didn't originally care about it, they suddenly see it as more valuable than before. But why does this happen? It all comes down to our brain's deep-rooted fear of loss. Humans are naturally loss-averse. We hate losing things more than we enjoy gaining them. When you own something, losing it feels like a loss, and your brain inflates its worth to justify keeping it. Here's a classic experiment that proves it. In 1990, researchers Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Richard Thaler divided people into two groups. One group received a coffee mug. The other group received nothing. Then, they asked the mug owners how much they'd sell their mugs for, and asked the non-owners how much they'd pay to buy one. The result: the people who owned the mugs wanted almost twice as much money to sell them as the buyers were willing to pay. Same mug, different value. All because of ownership. So how does this get used against you? Let's start with marketing. Ever notice how free trials hook you? Companies like Netflix, Spotify, and Amazon Prime give you a free month. And after that, it's painfully hard to cancel. Why? Because after using the service, you feel like it's yours. You've mentally claimed it. The thought of losing access feels like giving up something valuable, even though you didn't care about it before. This also explains why car dealerships push test drives. The moment you sit in the car, feel the leather seats, and imagine driving it to work, your brain starts attaching ownership to it. Even if you haven't bought it yet, by the time you're back in the dealership, the idea of walking away feels like a loss. Real estate agents use this too. They encourage potential buyers to imagine their furniture in the house, picture family dinners in the dining room, and mentally move in. The more you picture yourself owning the house, the harder it is to let it go. And the more you're willing to pay. It doesn't stop at sales. The endowment effect fuels toxic relationships and manipulative friendships. Ever stayed in a bad relationship because you'd already invested so much time into it? That's the endowment effect tricking you. It convinces you that the longer you hold on to something, even if it's bad for you, the more valuable it becomes. You're not staying because the relationship is good. You're staying because losing it feels worse than starting over. It even shows up in negotiations. Skilled negotiators know that if they can make you feel like you already own the deal, like it's within your grasp, you'll fight harder to keep it. For example, imagine you're negotiating a job offer. The recruiter describes the role, the office perks, the exciting projects you'll work on, making you feel like the job is practically yours. Then they hit you with a lower salary offer than you wanted. By now, though, you've mentally claimed the job. Turning it down feels like losing something that was already yours, so you're more likely to accept the lower offer. So, how do you protect yourself from this psychological trap? First, recognize when it's happening. If you suddenly feel like you can't let go of something, whether it's a product, a relationship, or a deal, stop and ask yourself, do I actually want this? Or do I just feel like I own it? Separating emotional attachment from real value is key. Second, create distance. The endowment effect relies on you feeling connected to the thing in question. If you take a step back, physically and emotionally, that connection weakens. For example, if you're debating whether to sell an old car, imagine it belongs to someone else. Would you still think it's worth that much? Probably not. Third, Flip the script. Imagine the opposite scenario. If you didn't own this item, would you spend the same amount of money to buy it right now? If the answer is no, then the endowment effect is controlling you. The takeaway. The endowment effect is powerful. But once you see it for what it is, you break free from its hold. Whether it's a manipulative salesperson, a toxic relationship, or even your own cluttered closet, knowing why you overvalue things gives you the power to let go. Ownership doesn't create value. Your mind does. And now you know how to take that power back.